Discomfort in culture. Sigmund Freud. Discomfort in culture. We cannot escape the impression that man tends to apply false canons in his assessments, because while he yearns for himself and admires power, success, and wealth in others, he despises, on the other hand, the genuine values that life offers him. However, when formulating a general judgment of this kind, there is always the danger of forgetting the variegated variety of the human world and of its mental life, since there are, in fact, some beings to whom the veneration of their contemporaries is not denied. Despite the fact that his greatness rests on qualities and works that are far removed from the objectives and ideals of the masses. It will be argued that it is only a select minority that recognizes these great men at their fair value, while the vast majority wants nothing to do with them, but the discrepancies between men's ideas and actions are so wide and their desires so disparate that such reactions are surely not so simple. One of these exceptional men declares himself my friend in his letters. Having sent him my little work that deals with religion as an illusion, he replied that he unreservedly shared my judgment on religion, but regretted that I had not given its due value to the ultimate source of religiosity. This would reside, according to his criteria, in a particular feeling that he would never have stopped perceiving, that many people would have confirmed to him and whose existence he could suppose in millions of human beings, a feeling that he would like to call a feeling of eternity, a feeling as of something without limits or barriers, somehow oceanic. It would be an essentially subjective experience, not an article of the creed, nor would it imply any assurance of personal immortality, but, nevertheless, this would be the source of religious energy, which, captured by the various churches and religious systems, is channeled into certain channels and surely also consumed in them. Only thanks to this oceanic feeling could one consider himself religious, even if he rejected all faith and all illusion. This declaration of a friend whom I revere, who, moreover, also once lent poetic expression to the charm of illusion, placed me in no small embarrassment, for I myself cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. In no way is it a pleasant task to submit feelings to scientific analysis. It is true that one can try to describe their physiological manifestations, but when this is not possible, and I am afraid that the oceanic feeling will also escape such a characterization, the only thing left to do is stick to the ideational content that is most easily associated with said feeling. My friend, if I have understood him correctly, is referring to the same thing that a certain original and highly unconventional poet makes his protagonist say, by way of consolation in the face of suicide. We cannot fall from this world. It would be, then, a feeling of indissoluble communion, of inseparable belonging to the totality of the external world. I must confess that for me this has more the character of an intellectual penetration, accompanied, naturally, by effective overtones, which, moreover, are not lacking in other cognitive acts of a similar magnitude. In my own person I could not be convinced of the primary nature of such a feeling, but this does not mean that I have the right to deny its real occurrence in others. The question is reduced, then, to establishing whether it is interpreted correctly and whether it should be accepted as fons et origo of all religious urgency. Nothing I can contribute that is capable of deciding the solution of this problem. The idea that man could intuit his relationship with the external world through a direct feeling, oriented from the beginning towards this end, seems so strange and is so incongruous with the structure of our psychology that it will be legitimate to attempt a psychoanalytic explanation. That is, genetics of the aforementioned feeling. In undertaking this task we are instantly offered the following reasoning. Under normal conditions nothing seems to us as secure and established as the sensation of our sameness, of our own ego. This self appears to us as something independent, unitary, well demarcated from everything else. Only psychoanalytic research, which, moreover, still has much to tell us about the relationship between the ego and the id, has taught us that this appearance is deceptive, that, on the contrary, the self continues inwards, without precise limits, with an unconscious psychic entity that we call id and which it comes to serve as a facade. But, outwardly at least, the self seems to keep its boundaries clear and precise. He only loses them in a state that, although extraordinary, it cannot be branded as pathological. At the culmination of falling in love, the limit between the self and the object threatens to disappear. Against all the testimonies of his senses, the lover affirms that I and you are one, and he is willing to behave as if it were really so. Of course, what can be temporarily annulled by a physiological function can also be disrupted by pathological processes. Pathology presents us with a large number of states in which the demarcation of the self from the outside world becomes uncertain, or where the limits become confused, cases in which parts of the body itself, even components of the psyche itself, perceptions, thoughts, feelings appear as if they were foreign and did not belong to the self, others, in which what is clearly attributed to the external world comes from the self and should be recognized by it. So that the ego feeling is also subject to disturbances, and the limits of the ego with the external world are not immutable. Continuing our reflection, we must tell ourselves that the sense of self of the adult cannot have been the same from the beginning, but must have undergone an evolution, impossible to demonstrate, of course, but capable of being reconstructed with a certain degree of probability. The infant still does not discern his self from an external world, as the source of the sensations that come to him. He gradually learns it under the influence of various stimuli. Undoubtedly, the fact that some of the sources of excitement which he will later recognize as the organs of his body are likely to cause sensations at any moment, while others are temporarily withdrawn between these, the one he craves the most, the maternal womb, managing to attract them only by expressing his urgency in crying. With this he begins by opposing the ego with an object in the form of something that is outside and for the appearance of which a particular action is necessary. A second stimulus for the ego to detach itself from the sensory mass, that is, for the acceptance of an outside, of an external world, is provided by the frequent, multiple, and inevitable sensations of pain and unpleasantness that the still omnipotent principle of pleasure induces to abolish and avoid. Thus arises the tendency to dissociate from the self everything that could become a source of displeasure, to expel it from oneself, to form a purely hedonic self, a pleasant self, confronted with a non-self, with an alien and threatening outside. The limits of this primitive pleasant self cannot escape further readjustments imposed by experience. Much of what one would not want to abandon due to its pleasant nature does not belong, however, to the self, but to objects. Reciprocally, many sufferings that one tries to get rid of turn out to be inseparable from the self, of internal origin. However, man learns to master a procedure that, through the intentional orientation of the senses and adequate muscular activity, allows him to discern the interior, belonging to the self, from the exterior, originating from the world, thus taking the first step towards the enthronement of the reality principle, a principle that will dominate all subsequent evolution. Naturally, this acquired capacity for discernment serves the practical purpose of avoiding perceived or threatening unpleasant sensations. The circumstance that the ego, when defending itself against certain unpleasant stimuli emanating from its interior, applies the same methods that serve it against unpleasantness of external origin, will become the origin of important pathological disorders. In this way, then, the self is separated from the external world, although it would be more correct to say, originally the self includes everything, then, it detaches from itself an external world. Our current sense of self is therefore nothing more than the atrophied residue of a broader feeling, even of universal scope, which corresponded to a more intimate communion between the self and the surrounding world. If it is possible to accept that this primary ego sense subsists, to a greater or lesser degree, in the psychic life of many human beings, it must be considered as a kind of contrast to the adult ego feeling, whose limits are more precise and restricted. In this way, the ideational contents that correspond to it would be precisely those of infinity and of communion with the all, the same ones that my friend uses to exemplify the oceanic feeling. But do we have the right to admit this survival of the primitive together with the later that has developed from it? Undoubtedly, because phenomena of this nature have nothing strange, neither in the psychic sphere nor in any other. Thus, as regards the zoological series, we support the hypothesis that the most evolved species have arisen from the inferior ones, but even today we find, among the living, all the simple forms of life. The great saurians have become extinct, giving way to mammals, but a genuine representative of that order still lives with us, the crocodile. This analogy may seem too remote, and, on the other hand, suffers from the fact that the lower surviving species are not usually the true ancestors of the current, more evolved ones. As a general rule, the intermediate links that we only know about through their reconstruction have disappeared. On the other hand, in the psychic field the conservation of the primitive together with the evolved to which it gave rise is so frequent that it would be idle to demonstrate it by means of examples. This phenomenon is almost always due to a bifurcation of the evolutionary course. A quantitative part of a certain attitude or an instinctive tendency has escaped all modification, while the rest followed the path of progressive development. We touch here on the general problem of conservation in the psychic, a problem hardly elaborated up to now, but so seductive and important that we can give it our attention for a moment, although the opportunity does not seem very justified. Having overcome the erroneous conception that forgetting, so common for us, means the destruction or annihilation of the mnemonic remainder, we are inclined to the opposite conception that in psychic life nothing once formed can ever disappear, everything is somehow preserved and can re-emerge under favorable circumstances, such as by regression of sufficient depth. Let us try to represent to ourselves what this hypothesis means by means of a comparison that will take us to another terrain. Let's take the evolution of the Eternal City as an example. Historians teach us that the oldest urban enclosure was the Roma Quadrata, a palisade town on the Palatine Hill. This first phase was followed by that of the Septimontium, a fusion of the populations located on the different hills. Later the city surrounded by the wall of Servio Tullio appeared, and even more recently, after all the transformations of the Republic and the First Empire, the enclosure that the Emperor Orleano surrounded with his walls. We do not have to pursue the changes that the city underwent any further, asking ourselves, instead, what remains of those bygone phases will still be found in present-day Rome by a tourist whom we suppose endowed with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge. You will see the Aurelian Wall almost intact, except for some gaps. In certain places you will be able to find pieces of the Servian Wall, exposed by the excavations. Provided with sufficient knowledge, superior to those of archaeology. Perhaps I could draw in the current urban picture the entire course of this wall and the outline of the Roma Quadrata, but of the constructions that once filled that ancient enclosure you will find nothing or only scant remains, since they have disappeared. Even with the best knowledge of Republican Rome, he could only point out the location of the temples and public buildings of that time. Today, these places are occupied by ruins, but not even by the authentic ruins of those monuments, but by those of later reconstructions, carried out after fires and demolitions. It is hardly necessary to add that all these remains of ancient Rome appear scattered in the labyrinth of a metropolis built in the last centuries of the Renaissance. Its soil and its modern constructions surely still hide numerous relics. Such is the form of conservation of the past that historical places like Rome offer. Let us now suppose, as a fantasy, that Rome was not a place of human habitation, but a psychic entity with a no less rich and prolonged past, in which nothing that ever existed had disappeared and where, together with the last evolutionary phase subsisted all the previous ones. Applied to Rome, this would mean that the imperial palaces and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus were still to be built on the Palatine, in all their primitive appearance, that the battlements of Castel Sant'Angelo were still surmounted by the fine statues that adorned them before the siege by the Goths, etc. But even more, in the place where the Palazzo Caffarelli occupies, we would see again, without having to demolish this building, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and not only in its most recent form, as the Romans of the Caesarean period contemplated it, but also in the primitive, Etruscan, decorated with terracotta antefixes. In the current location of the Colosseum we could also admire the disappeared Domus Aurea of Nero, In Piazza della Rotonda we would not only find the current Pantheon as Hadrian bequeathed it to us, but also, on the same site, the original construction of M. Agrippa, and also, on this land, the Maria Sopra Minerva Church, not counting the ancient temple on which it was built. And it would suffice for the observer to change the direction of his gaze or his point of observation to give rise to one or another of these visions. Obviously, there is no point in following the thread of this fantasy, since it leads us to the inconceivable and even to the absurd. If we intend to represent the historical succession spatially, we can only do so by means of juxtaposition in space, since space does not accept two different contents. Our attempt seems to be a vain game. Its only justification is to show us how far we are from being able to capture the characteristics of psychic life through descriptive representation. We would still have to face another objection. We will be asked why we resort precisely to the past of a city to compare it with the psychic past. The hypothesis of the total conservation of the past is subject, also in psychic life, to the condition that the organ of the psyche has remained intact, that its tissues have not suffered from trauma or inflammation. But destructive influences comparable to these pathological factors are not lacking in the history of any city, even if its past is less troubled than Rome's, even if, like London, it has never been ravaged by an enemy. Even the most peaceful evolution of a city includes demolitions and reconstructions that in principle make it unsuitable for such comparison with a psychic organism. We surrender to this argument and, renouncing an illustrative effect of contrast, we resort to a simile that, in any case, is more akin to the psychic, the animal or the human organism. But here too we run into the same difficulty. The preceding phases of evolution do not subsist in any form, but are exhausted in the later ones whose material they have supplied. It is impossible to prove the existence of the embryo in the adult. The child's thymus, replaced by connective tissue during adolescence, has ceased to exist. It is true that in the long bones of the adult we can trace the outline of the infantile, but it has disappeared as it lengthened and thickened to reach its final shape. Consequently, we must submit to the verification that only in the psychic field is this persistence of all the previous stages possible, together with the definitive form, and that we will not be able to graphically represent such a phenomenon. But perhaps we are going too far with this conclusion. Perhaps we should be satisfied with affirming that the past can subsist in psychic life, that it is not necessarily doomed to destruction. Even in the psychic field, it is still possible as a rule or exceptionally that many archaic elements are erased or consumed to such an extent that no process manages to restore or revive them. Moreover, its conservation could in principle be subject to certain favorable conditions. All this is possible, but we know nothing about it. We cannot but hold to the conclusion that in psychic life the preservation of the past is the rule rather than a curious exception. Thus, we are fully willing to accept that in many beings there is a oceanic feeling, which we are inclined to reduce to an early phase of the sense ego, but then we are faced with a new question: what claims can that feeling make in order to be accepted as the source of religious needs? For my part, this claim does not seem very well founded, since a feeling can only be a source of energy if, in turn, it is an expression of an imperative need. As for religious needs, I consider their derivation from childhood helplessness and from the nostalgia for the father that it arouses irrefutable, all the more so since this feeling is not simply maintained from childhood, but is constantly revived by anguish in the face of death. Omnipotence of fate. It would be impossible for me to indicate any infantile need as powerful as that of parental protection. With this, the role of oceanic feeling recedes into the background, which could tend, for example, to re-establish unlimited narcissism. The genesis of the religious attitude can be clearly traced back to the feeling of childish helplessness. It is possible that it hides still other elements, but for now they are lost in darkness. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling has subsequently come to be related to religion, since this being one with the all, implicit in its ideative content, seduces us as a first attempt at religious consolation, as another way to refute the danger that the self recognizes as threatening in the outside world. I confess once again that it is very difficult for me to operate with these intangible magnitudes. Another of my friends, led by his insatiable scientific curiosity to the most extraordinary experiences and finally becoming all-knowing, assured me that through the practices of yoga, that is, withdrawing from the outside world, fixing attention on bodily functions, breathing in a particular way, he actually manages to awaken in himself new sensations and diffuse feelings, which he intended to conceive as regressions to primordial states of psychic life, deeply buried. He considered such phenomena as evidence, somewhat physiological, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. We would be offered here relationships with many enigmatic states of mental life, such as those of trance and ecstasy. But I feel the impulse to repeat the words of Schiller's diver. Rejoice who breathes in the rosy light of day. My study on the future of an illusion, far from being mainly devoted to the deepest sources of religious meaning, concerned rather what the common man conceives of as his religion, the system of doctrines and promises that, on the one hand, they explain to him with enviable integrity the enigmas of this world, and on the other hand, they assure him that a solicitous providence will preserve his life and reward in an afterlife any eventual privations he suffers in it. The common man cannot represent this providence except in the form of a greatly exalted Father, for only such a Father would be able to understand the needs of the human creature, be moved by his prayers, be appeased by the manifestations of his repentance. All of this is to such an infantile point, so incongruous with reality, that the slightest humanitarian sense will make us painful the idea that the vast majority of mortals could never rise by such a conception of life. It is even more humiliating to recognize how numerous they are. Our contemporaries who, forced to recognize the untenable position of this religion, nevertheless try to defend it inch by inch in pitiful retreat actions. One is tempted to join the ranks of believers to exhort not to call on the name of the Lord in vain, those philosophers who believe they can save the God of religion by replacing it with an impersonal, nebulously abstract principle. If some of the greatest minds of past times did the same, that is not a sufficient justification, for we know why they were forced to do it. Let us return to the common man and his religion, the only one that was to bear this name. Immediately the well-known words of one of our great poets and sages come to our minds, which speak to us of the relations that religion has with art and science. Here they are. Whoever has science and art also has religion, who does not own one or the other. Have religion. This aphorism confronts, on the one hand, religion with the two greatest creations of man, and on the other, it affirms that they can represent or replace each other in terms of their value for life. So that if we also tried to deprive the common mortals of religion, the authority of the poet would obviously not support us. Let us try, then, another way to approach the understanding of his thought. As it has been imposed on us, life is too heavy for us, it brings us excessive suffering, disappointments, impossible undertakings. To endure it, we cannot do without lenitives, you cannot do without crutches, Theodore Fontaine told us. There are perhaps three kinds: powerful distractions that make our misery seem small, substitute satisfactions that reduce it, narcotics that make us insensitive to it. Any one of these remedies is indispensable to us. Voltaire alludes to distractions when, in Candide, he formulates the advice to cultivate our garden as a consignment. Also scientific activity is a similar diversion. Substitute satisfactions as offered by art are, compared to reality, illusions, but no less psychically effective for this, thanks to the role that imagination maintains in mental life. As for narcotics, they influence our organs and modify their chemistry. It is not easy to indicate the place that corresponds to religion in this series. We will have to seek, therefore, a broader access to the matter. On countless occasions the question of the purpose of human life has been raised, without ever being given a satisfactory answer, and perhaps not even admitting such an answer. Many of these inquisitors have been quick to add that if it turned out that human life has no purpose, it would lose all value in their eyes. But these threats are of no use. It would seem rather that one has the right to reject the question itself, since its raison d'être probably emanates from that anthropocentric vanity, whose multiple manifestations we already know. He never asks about the object of life of animals, unless it is identified with the destiny of serving man. But this is not sustainable either, since there are many animals with which man does not know what to do outside of describing, classifying, and studying them, and countless species have even declined to serve this purpose, existing and disappearing long before man. I could watch them. Decidedly, only religion can answer the question about the purpose of life. We will not be mistaken in concluding that the idea of awarding an object to human life cannot exist except as a function of a religious system. Let us therefore abandon the previous question and face this more modest one. What ends and purposes of life do men express in their own conduct? What do you expect from life? What do you intend to achieve in it? It is difficult to get the answer wrong. They aspire to happiness, they want to become happy, they do not want to stop being happy. This aspiration has two faces, a positive end and a negative one. On the one hand, to avoid pain and displeasure, on the other, experiencing intense pleasurable sensations. In a strict sense, the term happiness only applies to the second end. In accordance with this duality of the objective pursued, the human activity unfolds in two directions, depending on whether it tries to achieve prevalently or exclusively one or the other of those ends. As noted, whoever sets the vital goal is simply the program of the pleasure principle that governs the operations of the psychic apparatus from its very origin, a principle whose adequacy and efficiency cannot be doubted, even though its program is in conflict with the entire world, both with the macrocosm and with the microcosm. This program is not even achievable, since the entire order of the universe opposes it, and we would even be about to affirm that the plan of creation does not include the purpose of making man happy. What in the strictest sense is called happiness arises from the satisfaction, almost always instantaneous, of accumulated needs that have reached high tension, and according to this nature it can only occur as an episodic phenomenon. Any persistence of a situation yearned for by the pleasure principle only provides a sensation of lukewarm well-being, since our disposition does not allow us to intensely enjoy anything other than the contrast, but only to a very limited extent what is stable. Thus, our faculties of happiness are already limited in principle by our own constitution. Instead, it is much less difficult for us to experience misfortune. Suffering threatens us from three sides: from the body itself, which, condemned to decay and annihilation, cannot even do without the warning signs that represent pain and anguish; from the outside world, capable of inflicting on us with omnipotent and implacable destructive forces; finally, relationships with other human beings. The suffering that emanates from this last source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. We tend to consider it as a more or less gratuitous addition, despite the fact that it could well be as unavoidable a destination as suffering of different origins. We should not be surprised, then, that under the pressure of such possibilities of suffering, man tends to lower his claims to happiness, just as, on the other hand, the pleasure principle also transforms, under the influence of the external world, into the most modest principle of happiness. Of reality, it does not surprise us that the human being already considers himself happy for the mere fact of having escaped misfortune, of having survived suffering, that, in general, the purpose of avoiding suffering relegates that of achieving pleasure to the background. Reflection shows that the attempts to achieve it can take us along very different paths, all recommended by the multiple schools of human wisdom and undertaken at some time by the human being. In the first place, the unlimited satisfaction of all needs is imposed on us as the most tempting rule of conduct, but it means preferring pleasure to prudence, and little after practicing it, its consequences make themselves felt. The other methods, which seek above all the avoidance of suffering, differ according to the source of unpleasure to which they give maximum attention. There are extreme and moderate procedures among them, some unilateral, and others that simultaneously attack several points. Voluntary isolation, distance from others, is the most immediate method of protection against suffering that can originate in human relationships. It is clear that the happiness attainable by such a path cannot be other than that of stillness. Against the fearsome outside world one can only defend oneself by any form of alienation if one wants to solve this problem only for oneself. There is, of course, another better way, to go on the attack against nature and submit it to the will of man, as a member of the human community, using the technique directed by science. Thus, we work with everyone for the well-being of all. But the most interesting preventives of suffering are those that try to influence our own organism, because ultimately all suffering is nothing more than a sensation. It only exists as long as we feel it, and we only feel it by virtue of certain dispositions of our organism. The crudest, but also the most effective of the methods intended to produce such modification, is the chemical one, intoxication. I don't think anyone has understood its mechanism, but it is clear that there are certain substances foreign to the body whose presence in the blood or in the tissues directly gives us pleasant sensations, also modifying the conditions of our sensitivity in such a way that they prevent us from perceiving unpleasant stimuli. Both effects are not only simultaneous, but also appear to be closely linked. But in our own chemism there must also be substances that fulfill a similar purpose, since we know of at least one pathological state, mania, in which such behavior occurs, similar to drunkenness, without the incorporation of any drug. Also in our normal psychic life, the discharge of pleasure oscillates between facilitation and restraint, and in parallel decreases or increases receptivity to displeasure. It is very unfortunate that this toxic aspect of mental processes has hitherto eluded scientific investigation. Such a beneficial character is attributed to the action of narcotic drugs in the fight for happiness and in the prevention of misery, that both individuals and nations have reserved a permanent place for them in their libidinal economy. They are not only owed the immediate pleasure, but also a long-awaited measure of independence from the outside world. Men know that with this relief they will always be able to escape the weight of reality, taking refuge in a world of their own that offers better conditions for their sensitivity. It is also known that it is precisely this quality of narcotics that entails its danger and harmfulness. In certain circumstances they still bear the blame for the sterile dissipation of large quantities of energy that could be applied to improve human luck. However, the complicated architecture of our psychic apparatus is also accessible to a whole host of other influences. The satisfaction of the instincts, precisely because it implies such happiness, becomes a cause of intense suffering when the outside world deprives us of it, denying us the satisfaction of our needs. Therefore, it can be hoped that by influencing these instinctual drives we will avoid much of the suffering. But this way of avoiding pain no longer acts on the sensitive apparatus, but tries to dominate the very internal sources of our needs, achieving it to an extreme degree by annihilating the instincts, as taught by Eastern wisdom and practiced by yoga. Of course, achieving it means at the same time abandoning all other activity, sacrificing life, to win back, although by a different path, only the happiness of absolute rest. The same path, with a less extreme objective, is undertaken when pursuing only the moderation of the instinctive life under the government of the superior psychic instances, subject to the principle of reality. This does not in any way mean giving up the purpose of satisfaction, but a certain protection against suffering is achieved, because the dissatisfaction of controlled instincts causes less pain than that of uninhibited ones. On the other hand, there is an undeniable limitation of the possibilities of pleasure, since the feeling of happiness experienced when satisfying an indomitable instinctual drive, not held by the reins of the ego, is incomparably more intense than the one felt when satiating a dominated instinct. Such is the economic reason for the irresistible character that perverse impulses reach, and perhaps for the seduction exerted by the forbidden in general. Another technique to avoid suffering uses the displacements of the libido foreseen in our psychic apparatus and that confer great flexibility to its functioning. The problem is to reorient the instinctive ends in such a way that they avoid the frustration of the external world. The sublimation of the instincts contributes to this, and its result will be optimal if one knows how to increase the pleasure of mental and intellectual work. In such a case fate can affect us little. Satisfactions of this kind, like the one the artist experiences in creation, in the embodiment of his fantasies, that of the researcher in solving his problems and in discovering the truth, are of a special quality that we will surely be able to characterize one day in metapsychological terms. For now we have to limit ourselves to saying, metaphorically, that they seem to us more noble and higher, but their intensity, compared with the satisfaction of the gross and primal instinctual impulses, is very attenuated and in no way moves us physically. But the weak point of this method is that its applicability is not general, that it is only accessible to a few beings, since it presupposes peculiar dispositions and aptitudes that are not precisely habitual, at least not to a sufficient extent. And even to these rare individuals he cannot offer complete protection against suffering. It does not cover them with an impenetrable armor to the arrows of destiny and usually fails when the body itself becomes a source of pain. The tendency to become independent from the outside world, seeking satisfaction in internal psychic processes, already manifested in the procedure described, is denoted with even greater intensity in the one that follows. Here, the link with reality is further relaxed, satisfaction is obtained in illusions that are recognized as such, without their discrepancy with the real world preventing them from being enjoyed. The field from which these illusions come is that of the imagination, a field that in the past, when the sense of reality developed, was expressly withdrawn from the demands of the judgment of reality, reserving it for the satisfaction of desires that were difficult to achieve. At the head of these satisfactions, imaginative finds the enjoyment of the work of art, accessible even to those lacking creative skills, thanks to the mediation of the artist. Whoever is sensitive to the influence of art will not be able to estimate it too much as a source of pleasure and as a consolation for the sorrows of life. But the slight narcosis in which art plunges us only provides a fleeting refuge from the hazards of existence and lacks sufficient power to make us forget real misery. More energetic and radical is the action of another procedure, the one that sees in reality the only enemy, the source of all suffering, which makes existence intolerable for us and with whom, consequently, it is necessary to break all relations if one wants to be happy in any way. Sense. The hermit turns his back on this world and wants nothing to do with it. But one can also go further, striving to transform it, building in its place a new world in which the most intolerable features are eliminated, replaced by others suited to one's own desires. Whoever in desperate rebellion adopts this path to happiness will generally not get very far, since reality is the strongest. He will become a madman who will be helped by few in carrying out his delusions. However, it is claimed that we all behave, at one point or another, just like the paranoid, amending some intolerable aspect of the world through a wishful creation and including this chimera in reality. Of particular importance acquires the case in which numerous individuals undertake together the attempt to procure happiness insurance and protection against pain by means of a delusional transformation of reality. Also, the religions of humanity must be considered as similar collective delusions. Of course, none of those who share the delusion can ever recognize it as such. I do not think that this enumeration of the methods with which man strives to conquer happiness and ward off suffering is complete. I also know that the same material lends itself to other classifications. There is a method that I haven't mentioned yet, not because he has forgotten, but because he has yet to occupy us in another respect. How could one forget precisely this technique of the art of living? It is distinguished by the most curious combination of characteristic features. Naturally, she also pursues the independence of fate, such is the expression that fits here, and with this intention he transfers satisfaction to the internal psychic processes, using for this purpose the already mentioned displaceability of the libido, but without for this reason separating himself from the external world, clinging instead to his objects and finding the happiness in the affective bond with them. On the other hand, in doing so, he does not settle for the resigned and weary goal of avoiding suffering, but he puts it aside without paying attention to it, to concentrate on the primordial and passionate yearning for the positive fulfillment of happiness. Perhaps you get much closer to this goal than any of the above methods. Naturally, I mean that orientation of life that makes love the center of all things, that derives all satisfaction from loving and being loved. Such a psychic attitude is familiar to all of us. One of the forms in which love manifests itself, sexual love, provides us with the most powerful and captivating pleasurable experience, thus establishing the prototype of our aspirations for happiness. Nothing more natural that we continue looking for it along the same path that allowed us to find it for the first time. The weak point of this technique of life is too obvious, and if it were not so, no one would have thought of abandoning such a path to happiness for another. Indeed, we are never so at the mercy of suffering as when we love, we are never so helplessly unhappy as when we have lost the loved object to its love. But the technique of life that is based on the aptitude of love to procure happiness is not exhausted with this. Much remains to be said about it. It is worth adding here the interesting case that the happiness of life is sought above all in the enjoyment of beauty, wherever it is accessible to our senses and our judgment, be it beauty in human forms and gestures, in objects of nature, passages, or in artistic and even scientific creations. This aesthetic orientation of the vital purpose hardly protects us against imminent suffering, but it can compensate us for many sorrows suffered. The enjoyment of beauty has a particular emotional character, slightly intoxicating. Beauty has no obvious utility, nor is its cultural need manifest, and yet culture could not do without it. The science of aesthetics investigates the conditions under which things are perceived as beautiful, but it has not succeeded in explaining the essence and origin of beauty, and as usual, its fruitlessness is concealed by a display of very loud, but poor of sense. Unfortunately, psychoanalysis doesn't have much to tell us about beauty either. The only sure thing seems to be its derivation from the field of sexual sensations, representing an exemplary model of a trend that has ended. Primitively, the beauty and charm are attributes of the sexual object. It is remarkable that the genital organs themselves are almost never considered beautiful, despite the invariable exciting effect of their contemplation. Instead, said property seems to be inherent in certain secondary sexual characters. Despite its fragmentary condition, I dare to close our study with some conclusions. The desire to be happy that the pleasure principle imposes on us is unrealizable, but for this reason one should not, nor can one, abandon the efforts to approach its realization in any way. For this purpose, we can adopt very different paths, prioritizing the positive aspect of said end obtaining pleasure and its negative aspect avoiding pain But none of these resources will allow us to achieve what we long for. Happiness, considered in the limited sense, the realization of which seems possible, is merely a problem of the libidinal economy of each individual. No rule in this regard is valid for everyone, each one must seek for himself the way in which he can be happy. Your choice of the path to follow will be influenced by the most diverse factors. It all depends on the amount of real satisfaction you can expect from the outside world, and on the extent to which you are inclined to become independent of it, finally, also of the strength that he attributes to himself to modify it according to his wishes. Already here the psychic constitution of the individual plays a determining role, apart from external circumstances. The predominantly erotic human being will put the affective ties that bind him to other people. The narcissist, inclined to be self-sufficient, will seek the essential satisfactions in his intimate psychic processes. The man of action will never leave an external world in which he can measure his forces. In the second of these types, the orientation of the interests will be determined by the nature of his vocation and by the measure of the instinctual sublimations that are within his reach. Any extreme decision in the choice will make itself felt, exposing the individual to the dangers involved in the possible insufficiency of any chosen vital technique, to the exclusion of the rest. Just as the prudent trader avoids investing all his capital in a single trade, so also wisdom may advise us not to do. All satisfaction must depend on a single tendency, since its success is never certain. It depends on the concurrence of numerous factors, and perhaps none more than on the faculty of the psychic apparatus to adapt its functions to the world and to take advantage of it in the realization of the pleasure. Whoever comes into the world with a particularly unfavorable instinctual constitution will hardly find happiness in his environmental situation, especially when faced with difficult tasks, unless he has carried out the profound transformation and restructuring of his libidinal components, essential for all future performance. The last technique of life that remains to him and that offers him at least substitute satisfactions is the escape into neurosis, a resource to which he generally appeals already in his youthful years. Whoever sees his efforts to achieve happiness fail at a mature age will still find consolation in the pleasure of chronic intoxication or will undertake that desperate attempt at rebellion that is psychosis. Religion comes to disturb this free game of choice and adaptation, by imposing on everyone equally its unique path to achieve happiness and avoid suffering. His technique consists of reducing the value of life and deliriously distorting the image of the real world, measures that have the intimidation of intelligence as a prerequisite. At this price, by forcibly imposing on man the fixation of a psychic infantilism and making him participate in a collective delusion, religion manages to prevent many beings from falling into individual neurosis. But nothing else reaches. As we already know, there are many paths that can lead to happiness, insofar as it is accessible to man, but none that allows it to be achieved safely. Nor can religion keep its promises, since the believer, forced to invoke the inscrutable designs of God in the last resort, thereby confesses that in suffering he only has unconditional submission as the last consolation and source of joy. And if he was already willing to accept it from the start, he might as well have avoided all that long detour. Our study of happiness has not so far taught us much beyond what is known to the whole world. The prospects of discovering something new do not seem to be more promising either, although we continue the inquiry, asking ourselves why it is so difficult for man to be happy. We have already responded by pointing out the three sources of human suffering: the supremacy of nature, the expiration of our own body, and the insufficiency of our methods to regulate human relations in the family, the state, and society. As regards the first two, our judgment cannot waver long, since we are forced to recognize them and bow to the inevitable. We will never fully master nature. Our body, which is part of it, will always be perishable and limited in its ability to adapt and perform. But this verification is by no means discouraging; on the contrary, it points the direction to our activity. We can at least overcome some sorrows, although not all; others we manage to mitigate them. Several millennia of experience have convinced us of this. Very different is our attitude towards the third reason for suffering, that of social origin. We absolutely refuse to accept it. We fail to understand why the institutions that we ourselves have created should not rather represent protection and well-being for all. However, if we consider how badly we have obtained precisely the sector of prevention against suffering, we begin to suspect that a portion of indomitable nature could also be hidden here, this time being our own psychic constitution. On the verge of dealing with this eventuality, we come across a statement so startling that it holds our attention. According to her, our so-called culture would bear much of the blame for the misery we suffer, and we could be much happier if we abandoned it to return to more primitive living conditions. I qualify this statement as surprising, because whatever the meaning given to the concept of culture, it is undeniable that all the resources with which we try to defend ourselves against threatening suffering come precisely from that culture. By what paths have so many men arrived at this strange attitude of hostility against culture? I believe that a deep and ancient discontent with the respective state. Cultural culture constituted the terrain in which certain historical circumstances germinated its condemnation. It seems to me that I am able to identify the last and the penultimate of these reasons, but erudition is not enough to pursue their chain further in the history of the human species. Such an anti-cultural factor must already have intervened in the triumph of Christianity over pagan religions, taking into account its intimate affinity with the depreciation of earthly life implicit in Christian doctrine. The penultimate reason arose when the exploratory trips were extended, contact was made with primitive races and peoples. The Europeans, observing superficially and misinterpreting their uses and customs, imagined that these peoples led a simple, modest, and happy life, which must have seemed unattainable to explorers of a higher cultural level. Subsequent experience has rectified many of these judgments, since in many cases such ease of life had been attributed to the lack of complicated cultural demands, when in reality it was due to the generosity of nature and the comfortable satisfaction of elementary needs. As for the last of those historical motivations, we know it very closely. It occurred when man learned to understand the mechanism of neuroses, which threatened to undermine the meager remnant of happiness accessible to civilized humanity. Thus, it was verified that the human being falls into neurosis because he cannot bear the degree of frustration that society imposes on him for the sake of its ideals of culture, deducing from this that it would be possible to reconquer the prospects of being happy, eliminating or attenuating to a great degree these cultural demands. Add to this the influence of a certain disappointment. In the course of the last few generations, humanity has made extraordinary progress in the natural sciences and in their technical application, strengthening its dominance over nature to a previously inconceivable extent. We will not announce, for everyone's knowledge, the details of these advances. Man is rightly proud of such conquests, but he begins to suspect that this recently acquired mastery of space and time, this subjection to natural forces, the fulfillment of a multi-millennial longing, has not elevated the pleasurable satisfaction he demands from life, not it has made him, in his opinion, happier. We should limit ourselves to deducing from this verification that mastery over nature is not the only requirement for human happiness as, on the other hand, it is not the exclusive goal of cultural aspirations. Without inferring from it that technical progress is useless for the economy of our happiness. Indeed, is it not a positive pleasant experience, an undeniable increase in my happiness, if I can listen at will to the voice of my son who is hundreds of kilometers away? Yes, as soon as my friend has disembarked, I can find out that he has endured his long and painful journey well? Doesn't it mean anything that medicine has managed to reduce infant mortality so extraordinarily, the danger of puerperal infections, and even considerably prolong the years of life of civilized man? To these benefits, which we owe to the much vilified era of scientific and technical progress, I could still add a long series, but here the voice of the pessimistic critic makes itself heard, warning us that most of these satisfactions would be like that gratuitous fawn praised in a certain anecdote: all you have to do is stick your bare leg out from under the blanket, on a cold winter night, to be able to procure the pleasure of covering it up again. Without the railroad going the distance, our son would never have left his hometown, and we wouldn't need the phone to hear his voice. Without the transatlantic navigation, the friend would not have made the long voyage, and I would no longer need the telegraph to reassure me about his fate. What good is it for us to reduce infant mortality if precisely this forces us to adopt maximum prudence in procreation, so that, after all, today we do not raise more children than in the days before the hegemony of hygiene, and instead we have subordinated our sexual life in marriage to painful conditions, probably acting in the opposite direction to the beneficial natural selection? What use is a long life to us, finally, if it is so miserable, so poor in joy and rich in suffering that we can only greet death as happy liberation? It seems certain, then, that we do not feel very comfortable in our current culture, but it is very difficult to judge if and to what extent the men of yore were happier, as well as the part that their cultural conditions played in it. We will always have to objectively appreciate misery, that is, to situate ourselves in those conditions with our own claims and sensitivities, to then examine the reasons for happiness or suffering that we would find in them. This apparently objective manner of appreciation, because it abstracts from the variations to which subjective sensibility is subjected, is, naturally, the most subjective that can occur, since in the place of any of the unknown psychic dispositions of others places ours. But happiness is something deeply subjective. In spite of all the horror that certain situations can cause us, that of the former galley slave, of the serf in the 30 Years' War, of the condemned by the Holy Inquisition, of the Jew who awaits the hour of persecution. It is not, however, it is impossible to place ourselves in the state of mind of these beings, to intuit the nuances of the initial stupor, the gradual dullness, the abandonment of all expectations, the gross or fine forms of narcotization of sensitivity in the face of pleasant and unpleasant stimuli. In situations of maximum suffering, certain psychic protection mechanisms are also put into operation. But it seems to me fruitless to pursue this aspect of the problem further. It is time that we dedicate ourselves to the essence of this culture, whose value for human happiness has been so much questioned. We must not claim a formula that defines this essence in a few terms, even before having learned something more by examining it. Consequently, we will content ourselves with repeating that the term culture designates the sum of the productions and institutions that distance our life from that of our animal ancestors and that serve two purposes: to protect man against nature and to regulate the relations of men with each other. To reach a greater understanding, we will examine one by one the features of culture, as it occurs in human communities. In doing so, we will unreservedly let ourselves be guided by common language, or as it is also called, by the sense of language, hoping that we will thus be able to give due consideration to deep insights that still resist expression in abstract terms. The beginning is easy: we accept as cultural all activities and useful goods for man, to put the earth at his service, to protect him against the force of the elements, etc. Here is the aspect of culture that gives rise to less doubt. In order not to fall short in history, we will consign as the first cultural acts the use of tools, the domination of fire and the construction of rooms. Among them, the conquest of fire stands out as an exceptional and unprecedented feat. As for the others, they opened paths for man that he has not stopped following ever since, and whose choice responds to reasons easy to guess. With tools, man perfects his organs, both motor and sensory, or eliminates the barriers that oppose his action. The machines supply him with gigantic forces, which he can direct, like his muscles, in any direction. Thanks to the ship and the plane, neither the water nor the air manage to limit their movements. With the lens he corrects the defects of his crystalline lens, and with the telescope he contemplates the most remote distances. Thanks to the microscope, he exceeds the limits of the visible imposed by the structure of his retina. With the photographic camera, he has created an instrument that fixes the fleeting optical impressions, a service that the phonograph renders to him with the no less fleeting auditory impressions, both instruments constituting materializations of his innate ability to remember, that is, from his memory. With the help of the telephone, he hears from a distance that even the fairy tale would respect as unreachable. Writing is, originally, the language of the absent, the house, a substitute for the maternal womb, the first home whose nostalgia may still persist in us, where we were so safe and felt so comfortable. It would be said that this realization of all or almost all of his fabulous desires, achieved by man with his science and technique, in this land that saw him appear for the first time as a weak animal and to which each new individual of his family is a fairy tale. Species re-enters inch of nature, as a helpless infant. All these goods can be considered by man as conquests of culture. For a long time, he had forged an ideal of omnipotence and omniscience that he embodied in his gods, attributing to them everything that seemed inaccessible to his desires or was forbidden to him, so that we can well consider these gods as ideals of culture. Now that he is very close to reaching this ideal, he has almost become a god himself, though certainly only to the extent that common human judgment deems an ideal feasible, never quite, in some things, not at all, in others, only half. Man has become, so to speak, a god with prosthetics, quite magnificent when he puts on all his gadgets, but these do not grow from his body, and sometimes they even give him many troubles. On the other hand, he has the right to console himself with the reflection that this development will not stop precisely in the year of grace 1930. Future times will bring new and perhaps inconceivable progress in this field of culture, further exalting the deification of man. But not. Let us forget, for the sake of our study, that today's man does not feel happy in his resemblance to God either. Thus, we recognize the high cultural level of a country when we verify that everything related to the exploitation of the earth by man and his protection against elemental forces is carried out with perfection and efficiency, that is, in 2 words, when everything is arranged for its greatest utility. In such a country, the rivers that threaten flooding will have to have their course regulated and their waters conducted by canals to the regions that lack them. The lands will be diligently cultivated and planted with the most suitable plants for their fertility, the mineral wealth of the subsoil will be actively exploited and converted into indispensable tools and accessories, the means of transport will be frequent, fast and safe, wild and harmful animals will have been exterminated and the breeding of domestic animals will flourish. But we still have other claims to culture, and what is significant, we hope to see them carried out precisely in the same countries. As if with this we wanted to deny the material demands that we have just formulated, we also celebrate as a manifestation of culture the fact that human diligence also focuses on things that seem to lack the slightest use, such as, for example, the floral decoration of the open urban spaces, along with their useful purpose of serving as playgrounds and ventilation sites, or the use of flowers for the same purpose in human habitation. At once we notice that the useless, whose value we hope to see appreciated by culture, is nothing but beauty. We demand that civilized man respect it wherever it appears in nature, and that, to the extent of his manual skill, he endow objects with it. But with this, our demands to culture are not exhausted, far from it, since we still hope to see in it the manifestations of order and cleanliness. We do not appreciate much the culture of an English country village in Shakespeare's time, when we learn that before the door of his birth house, in Stratford, stood a great dunghill. We are indignant and speak of barbarism, the antithesis of culture, when we find the paths of the Vienna forest full of trash. Any form of slovenliness seems to us incompatible with culture. We also extend this precept of cleanliness to our own body, learning with astonishment the bad smell that the person of the Sun King used to give off. We shake our heads at showing us on Isola Bella the tiny basin that Napoleon used for his morning ablution. We are not even surprised when someone manages to establish the consumption of soap as an index of culture. We adopt a similar attitude towards order, which, like cleanliness, we refer only to human work, but while we do not have to wait for cleanliness to reign in nature, order, on the other hand, we have copied from it. The observation of the great sidereal chronologies not only gave man the pattern, but also the first references to introduce order into his life. Order is a kind of repetition impulse that establishes once and for all when, where, and how a certain act must be carried out, so that in any corresponding situation we will save ourselves doubts and indecisions. The order, whose benefit is undeniable, allows man the maximum use of space and time, simultaneously saving his psychic energy. One would expect that it was imposed from the beginning and spontaneously in human activity, but strange as it may seem, it did not happen like that. Rather, man manifests in his work a natural tendency to carelessness, irregularity, and informality, requiring strenuous efforts to manage to direct him to imitate those celestial models. Obviously, beauty, order and cleanliness occupy a particular position among cultural requirements. No one will claim that they are as essential as the mastery of the forces of nature and other factors that we will yet know, but no one will be willing to relegate them as accessory things. Beauty, which we would not want to miss in culture, is already an example that it does not only pursue profit. The usefulness of the order is evident. As far as cleanliness is concerned, we will bear in mind that it is also prescribed by hygiene, a link that was probably not ignored by man even before the scientific prevention of diseases was achieved. But this utilitarian factor is not enough by itself to fully explain this hygienic tendency. Something else must necessarily intervene in it. But we do not believe that we can better characterize culture than through its appreciation and worship of higher psychic activities, of intellectual, scientific and artistic productions, or by the directing function of human life that it grants to ideas. Among these a prominent place is occupied by the religious systems whose complicated structure I tried to illuminate on another occasion, along with them are philosophical speculations, and, finally, what we could describe as ideal constructions of man, that is, his idea of a possible perfection of the individual, of the nation, or of humanity as a whole, as well as the claims that he establishes based on such ideas. The fact that these creations are not independent of each other, but, on the contrary, closely intertwined, makes both their formulation and their psychological derivation difficult. If we accept as a general hypothesis that the spring of all human activity is the desire to achieve both convergent ends, profit and pleasure, then we will also have to accept its validity for these other cultural manifestations, despite the fact that its action is only evident clearly in scientific or artistic activities. But there can be no doubt that the others also satisfy powerful needs of the human being, perhaps those that are only developed in a minority of men. Nor should we allow ourselves to be misled by our value judgments about some of these religious or philosophical ideals and systems, since whether we see them as the maximum creation of the human spirit, or whether they are despised as aberrations, it is necessary to recognize that their existence, and particularly its hegemony, indicate a high level of culture. As the last, but not the least important characteristic feature of a culture, we must consider the way in which the relations of men among themselves are regulated, that is to say, the social relations that concern the individual as a collaborating neighbor or sexual object of another, as a member of a family or of a state. Here is a field in which it will be particularly difficult for us to stay away from certain ideal conceptions and to establish what strictly has to be qualified as cultural. Let's begin by accepting that the cultural element was already implicit in the first attempt to regulate these social relations, since if such an attempt had been omitted, said relations would have been left to the discretion of the individual, that is to say, the strongest would have fixed them at the convenience of his interests and his instinctive tendencies. Nothing would change in the situation if this stronger character found himself, in turn, with another stronger than him. Human life in common becomes possible only when a majority more powerful than each individual comes together and holds together against any one of them. The power of such a community is then confronted, as law, with the power of the individual, which is branded as brute force. This substitution of individual power for that of the community represents the decisive step towards culture. Its essential character resides in the fact that the members of the community restrict their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the isolated individual did not recognize such restrictions. Thus, the first cultural requirement is that of justice, that is, the certainty that the legal order, once established, will no longer be violated in favor of an individual, without this implying a pronouncement on the ethical value of such right. The subsequent course of cultural evolution seems to tend so that this right ceases to express the will of a small group, caste, tribe, social class which in turn confronts, as a violently aggressive individuality, other perhaps larger masses. The final result must be the establishment of a right to which all or at least all individuals fit for community life have contributed with the sacrifice of their instincts, and which does not leave anyone once again, with the aforementioned limitation, at the mercy of brute force. Individual freedom is not an asset of culture, since it was maximum before any culture, although then it lacked value because the individual was hardly capable of defending it. Cultural development imposes restrictions on it, and justice demands that no one escape them. When the libertarian impetus is agitated in a human community, it may be a rebellion against some established injustice, thus favoring a new progress of culture and not ceasing, therefore, to be compatible with it, but it can also arise from the rest of the primitive personality that has not yet been dominated by the culture, thus constituting the foundation of a hostility against it. Consequently, the yearning for freedom is directed against certain forms and demands of culture, or against culture in general. Apparently, there is no means of persuasion that can induce man to transform his nature into that of an ant. Surely he will never stop defending his claim to individual freedom against the will of the mass. A good part of the struggles within humanity revolve around the sole purpose of finding an adequate balance, that is, one that gives happiness to all, between these individual demands and the collective, cultural ones, One of the problems of human destiny is whether this balance can be achieved in a given culture or whether the conflict itself is irreconcilable. By letting our common sense tell us which aspects of human life deserve to be called cultural, we have achieved a clear impression of the whole of culture, even though we have so far learned nothing that is not known to everyone. At the same time, we have been careful not to fall into the general prejudice that equates culture with perfection, that considers it as the path towards perfection, marked out for human beings. But here we are dealing with a certain conception that perhaps leads in another direction. Cultural evolution appears to us as a peculiar process that takes place in humanity and many of whose particularities seem familiar to us. We can characterize it by the changes it imposes on man's well-known instinctual dispositions, the satisfaction of which is, after all, the economic purpose of our life. Some of these instincts are consumed in such a way that in their place appears something that in the isolated individual we call a character trait. The child's anal eroticism offers us the most curious example of such a process. In the course of growth, his primitive interest in the excretory function, in his organs and their products, is transformed into the group of traits that we know as thrift, a sense of order and cleanliness, traits that are valuable and laudable as such, but are liable to be exacerbated up to a degree of notable predominance, constituting then what is called anal character. We don't know how this happens, but the certainty of such a conception cannot be doubted. Now, we have verified that order and cleanliness are essential precepts of culture, even though their vital necessity is not exactly obvious, nor is their ability to provide pleasure evident. Here we are introduced for the first time to the analogy between the process of culture and the libidinal evolution of the individual. Other instincts are forced to displace the conditions of their satisfaction, to pursue it by different paths, a process that in most cases coincides with the well-known mechanism of sublimation, of instinctual ends, while in some it can still be distinguished from this. The sublimation of the instincts constitutes an outstanding cultural element, because thanks to it the superior psychic activities, both scientific and artistic and ideological, can play a very important role in the life of civilized peoples. If we gave in to first impressions, we would be tempted to say that sublimation is, in principle, an instinctual destiny imposed by culture, but it will be convenient to think a little more about it. Finally, along with these two mechanisms, we find a third, which seems to us the most important, since it is necessary to recognize the extent to which culture rests on the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, to what extent its prior condition lies precisely in dissatisfaction, by suppression, repression, or some other process, of powerful instincts. This cultural frustration governs the vast domain of social relations between human beings, and we already know that in it lies the cause of the hostility opposed to all culture. This process will also pose difficult problems for our scientific work. There are many solutions that we will have to offer. It is not easy to understand how an instinct can be subtracted from its satisfaction, purpose that, on the other hand, is by no means free of dangers, because if such fraud is not financially compensated, serious disruptions will have to be expected. But if we want to establish the value that our concept of cultural development as a particular process comparable to the normal maturation of the individual deserves, we will undoubtedly have to face another problem, asking ourselves to what factors the evolution of culture owes its origin, how it arose and what determined his further course. 4. Here is an exorbitant task, before which we can well confess our diffidence. Let's see, then, how little of her I managed to catch a glimpse of. Primitive man, having discovered that it was literally in his hands to improve his destiny on earth through work, could no longer regard with indifference whether his neighbor worked with him or against him. His fellow men then acquired, in his eyes, the significance of collaborators with whom it was useful to live in community. Even earlier, in its anthropoid prehistory, it had adopted the habit of forming families, so that the members of these were probably its first auxiliaries. It is to be assumed that the constitution of the family was linked to a certain evolution suffered by the need for genital satisfaction, instead of presenting itself as an occasional guest who suddenly settles in one's home so as not to show signs of life for a long time after his departure, he became, on the contrary, a permanent tenant of the individual. With this, the male had reasons to keep the female with him, or, in more generic terms, the sexual objects, the females, for their part, not wanting to be separated from their helpless offspring, were also forced to remain, in their interest, next to the stronger male. In this primitive family, an essential element of culture is still missing, since the will of the boss and father was unlimited. In Totem and Taboo I tried to show the path that led from this primitive family to the next phase of life in society, that is, to fraternal alliances. The sons, triumphing over the father, had discovered that a partnership can be more powerful than the isolated individual. The totemic phase of culture is based on the restrictions that the brothers had to impose on each other to consolidate this new system. The precepts of the taboo thus constituted the first right, the first law. The life of men in common thus acquired a double foundation: on the one hand, the obligation to work imposed by external needs, on the other, the power of love, which prevented the man from dispensing with his sexual object, the woman, and from the woman, from that separated part of her womb that is the child. In this way, Eros and Ananke, love and need, became the parents of human culture, whose first result was to facilitate life in common for a greater number of beings. Given that these two powerful instances collaborated in this, it could be expected that the subsequent evolution would take place smoothly, leading to an increasingly perfect domination of the outside world and a progressive increase in the number of men included in the community. Thus, it is not easy to understand how this culture could stop making its members happy. Before inquiring into the possible origin of its eventual disturbances, let the recognition of love as one of the foundations of culture deflect us from our path, in order to fill a gap in our previous considerations. When we pointed out the experience that sexual, genital, love offers man the most intense pleasurable experiences, establishing, in short, the prototype of all happiness, we said that it should have induced him to continue searching in the field of sexual relations. All the satisfactions that life allows, so that genital eroticism would come to occupy the center of his existence. We add that such a path leads to a dangerous dependence on a part of the outside world on the chosen loved object thus exposing him to experience the greatest suffering when this object despises him or when infidelity or death take it from him. Here is why the sages of all time tried so insistently to dissuade men from choosing this path, which, however, retained all its appeal for a large number of beings. Thanks to their constitution, a small minority of these manages to find happiness through love, but for this he must submit the erotic function to vast and essential psychic modifications. These people become independent of the consent of the object, displacing to the action of loving the accent that originally rested on the experience of being loved, in such a way that they protect themselves against the loss of the object, directing their love in equal measure to all beings. Instead of dumping it on certain objects, finally, they avoid the vicissitudes and frauds of genital love, diverting it from its sexual end, that is, transforming instinct into an impulse limited to its end. The state in which they thus manage to place themselves, that attitude of ethereal and imperturbable tenderness, no longer bears much outward resemblance to the hectic and tempestuous genital love life from which it has been derived. Saint Francis of Assisi was perhaps the one who went the furthest in this use of love to achieve a sensation of inner happiness, a technique that, according to what we said, is one of those that facilitate the satisfaction of the pleasure principle, having been linked on multiple occasions to the religion, with which it probably coincides in those remote regions where the self is no longer differentiated from objects, and objects from each other. A certain ethical conception, whose deep motives we will still have to elucidate, claims to see in this disposition to universal love for humanity and for the world the highest attitude to which the human being can rise. However, we hasten to advance our two main objections in this regard. First of all, a love that does not discriminate loses a good part of its value in our eyes, because it commits an injustice in front of the object. Therefore, not all human beings deserve to be loved. That loving impulse that the family instituted continues to exert its influence on culture, both in its primitive form, without renouncing direct sexual satisfaction, and under its transformation into an end-restricted affection. In both variants, it perpetuates its function of uniting a growing number of beings with an intensity greater than that achieved by the interest of the work community. The imprecision with which the language uses the term love is thus genetically justified. This is the name given to the relationship between a man and a woman who have founded a family on the basis of their genital needs, but the positive feelings between parents and children, between brothers and sisters, are also called love, despite the fact that these ties must be considered as love with an inhibited end, as affection. It simply happens that the love restricted in its end was in its origin a fully sexual love, and it continues to be so in the human unconscious. Both loving tendencies, the sensual one and the one with an inhibited end, transcend the limits of the family and establish new bonds with beings that were hitherto strangers. Genital love leads to the formation of new families, the inhibited end, to friendships, which have value in culture, since they escape many restrictions of genital love, such as its exclusive character. However, the relationship between love and culture ceases to be unequivocal in the course of evolution. On the one hand, the first opposes the interests of the second, which in turn threatens it with sensitive restrictions. Such a divorce between love and culture seems, then, inevitable, but it is not easy to distinguish at once their motive. It begins by manifesting itself as a conflict between the family and the larger social community to which the individual belongs. We have already glimpsed that one of the main purposes of culture pursues the agglutination of men in large units, but the family is not willing to give up the individual. The more intimate the ties between family members, the greater their inclination to isolate themselves from others, the more difficult it will be for them to enter the larger social spheres. The phylogenetically oldest way of life in common, the only one that exists in childhood, resists being replaced by the cultural one, of more recent origin. Detachment from the family becomes for every adolescent a task whose solution is often facilitated by society through puberty and initiation rites. Thus one obtains the impression that obstacles inherent to all psychic development and basically also to all organic evolution operate here. The next discord is caused by women, who are quick to oppose the cultural current, exerting their delaying and conservative influence. Yet it is these same women who originally laid the foundation of the culture with the demands of their love. Women represent the interests of the family and sexual life. Cultural work, on the other hand, is becoming more and more a masculine task, imposing increasing difficulties on men and forcing them to sublimate their instincts, a sublimation for which women are scarcely gifted. Since man does not have unlimited amounts of psychic energy, he is forced to fulfill his tasks through an adequate distribution of libido. The part that he consumes for cultural purposes is removed, above all, from women and sexual life. The constant coexistence with other men and his dependence on relationships with them even take him away from his duties as a husband and father. The woman, thus seeing herself relegated to the background by the demands of culture, adopts a hostile attitude towards it. As for culture, its tendency to restrict sexual life is no less evident than the other, aimed at expanding the circle of its action. Already the first cultural phase, that of totemism, brings with it the prohibition of choosing an incestuous object, perhaps the bloodiest mutilation that the love life of man has suffered in the course of time. Taboo, law and customs have to establish new limitations that will affect both men and women. But not all cultures proceed equally far down this path, and, moreover, the material structure of society also influences the extent of remaining sexual freedom. We already know that culture obeys the rule of economic psychic necessity, since it is forced to subtract from sexuality a large part of the psychic energy it needs for its own consumption. In doing so, it adopts a conduct towards sexuality identical to that of a people or a social class that has managed to subject another to its exploitation. Fear of rebellion by the oppressed leads to more rigorous precautionary measures. Our Western European culture corresponds to a high point of this development. By beginning by severely proscribing the manifestations of life, Child sexual desire operates with full psychological justification, for the containment of adult sexual desires would offer no prospect of success if it were not facilitated by preparatory work in childhood. On the other hand, there is no justification for the fact that civilized society has even reached the point of denying the existence of these phenomena, easily demonstrable and even striking. The choice of object is restricted in the sexually mature individual to the opposite sex, and most extragenital satisfactions are prohibited as perversions. The imposition of an identical sexual life for all, implicit in these prohibitions, ignores the discrepancies presented by the innate or acquired sexual constitution of men, depriving many of them of all sexual enjoyment and thus becoming a source of grave injustice. The effect of these restrictive measures could be that normal individuals, that is, constitutionally fit to do so, pour all their sexual interest, without any reduction, into the channels that have been left open. But even heterosexual genital love, the only one that has escaped proscription, is still undermined by the restrictions of legitimacy and monogamy. The current culture clearly gives us to understand that it is only willing to tolerate sexual relations based on the unique and indissoluble union between a man and a woman, without admitting sexuality as a source of pleasure in itself, accepting it only as an instrument of human reproduction, which until now has not been able to be replaced. Of course, this situation corresponds to an extreme case, since we all know that in practice it cannot be carried out, even for a short time. Only weak beings submitted to such a broad restriction of their sexual freedom, while the stronger natures only accepted it on a compensatory condition, which will be dealt with later. Civilized society has been forced to close its eyes to many transgressions that, according to its own statutes, it should have prosecuted. However, it is also necessary to avoid the opposite error, believing that such a cultural attitude would be completely harmless, since it does not achieve all its purposes, since there can be no doubt that the sexual life of civilized man has suffered serious damage and sometimes reaches to seem to us a function that is in full involutionary process, like, as organic examples, our teeth and our hair. Perhaps we have the right to accept that it has suffered a significant impairment as what a source of happiness, that is, as a resource to fulfill our vital purpose. Sometimes we think we notice that the pressure of culture is not the only responsible factor, but that there would be something inherent to the very essence of the sexual function that deprives us of complete satisfaction, prompting us to follow other paths. It may be that we are wrong, but it's hard to say. V. The psychoanalytic experience has shown that the so-called neurotic people are precisely the ones who least support these frustrations of sexual life. Through their symptoms, they seek substitute satisfactions that, however, bring them suffering, either by themselves or by the difficulties that they cause with the outside world and with society. This last case is easily understood, but the first presents us with a new problem. Yet the culture still demands other sacrifices, in addition to those that affect sexual satisfaction. By reducing the difficulty of cultural evolution to the inertia of the libido, to its reluctance to abandon an old position for a new one, we have conceived it as a general evolutionary disorder. We hold more or less the same concept, deriving the antithesis between culture and sexuality from the fact that sexual love constitutes a relationship between two people, in which a third party can only play a superfluous or disturbing role, while, on the contrary, culture necessarily implies relationships between a greater number of people. At the maximum culmination of a love relationship, no interest in the outside world subsists, both lovers are self-sufficient and do not need the child in common to be happy. In no case, as in this one, does Eros translate with greater clarity the core of its essence, its purpose to merge several beings into one, but he refuses to go any further, once this goal has been achieved, in a proverbial way, in the falling in love of two people. So far, we could easily imagine a cultural community formed by similar double individualities, which, libidinally satisfied in themselves, were mutually linked by the ties of the community of work or interests. In such a case the culture would have no need to subtract energy from sexuality. But this laudable situation does not exist, nor has it ever existed, since reality shows us that culture is not satisfied with the ties of union that we have granted up to now, but also seeks to mutually link the members of the community with libidinal ties. Making use of any resource for this purpose, favoring any path that can establish powerful identifications between them, putting into play the maximum possible amount of libido with an inhibited purpose, to reinforce community ties through friendly ties. The realization of these purposes inevitably requires a restriction of sexual life, but we still do not understand the necessity that drove the culture to adopt this path and that grounds its opposition to sexuality. It must undoubtedly be a disturbing factor that we have not yet discovered. Perhaps we find the clue in one of the alleged ideals postulated by civilized society. It is the precept "you shall love your neighbor as yourself," which enjoys universal fame and is surely older than Christianity, despite the fact that it holds it as its most commendable conquest, but it is certainly not very old, since man did not yet know it in historical times. Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as if we were hearing it for the first time, then we will not be able to contain a feeling of astonishment and strangeness. Why would we have to? What good could it do us? But above all, how to achieve it? How could we adopt such an attitude? My love is something very precious to me, which I have no right to squander foolishly. It imposes obligations on me that I must be willing to fulfill with sacrifices. If I love someone, it is necessary that he deserve it by any title. I rule out here the utility that it could bring me, as well as its possible value as a sexual object, since these two forms of connection have nothing to do with the precept of love for one's neighbor. It would deserve my love if it resembled me in important aspects, to the point of such that I could love myself in it. I would deserve it if it were more perfect than I am, to such an extent that I could love in it the ideal of my own person. I should love him if he were my friend's son, for his pain. If something bad happened to him, it would also be my pain, I would have to share it. On the other hand, if he were strange to me and if none of his own values attracted me, no importance that he had acquired for my effective life, then it would be very difficult for me to love him. It would even be unfair if I loved him, since mine appreciate my love as a demonstration of preference, and it would do them injustice if I equated them with a stranger. But if I am to love him with that general love for the whole universe, simply because he too is a creature of this world, like the insect, the worm and the snake, then I am afraid that only a tiny part of love corresponds to him, not at all. As much as reason authorizes me to keep to myself. Why, then, is such a solemn presentation of a precept that nobody can reasonably be advised to comply with? Examining it more closely, I encounter new difficulties. This strange being is not only in general unworthy of love, but to admit it sincerely deserves my hostility and even my hatred much more. He doesn't seem to have the slightest love for me, he doesn't show me the slightest consideration. As long as it is of some use to him, he will not hesitate to harm me, and he will not even ask himself if the amount of his benefit corresponds to the magnitude of the damage he causes me. Even more, it is not even necessary that he derives a profit from it, it will suffice for him to experience the slightest pleasure so that he will have no scruples in denigrating me, offending me, slandering me, displaying his power over me, and the more secure he feels, the more helpless I find myself, the more surely I can expect from him this attitude towards me. If he behaved differently, if he showed me consideration and respect, despite the fact that I was a stranger to him, I would be willing to repay him in the same way, even if no precept forced me to do so. Even more, if that grand commandment read, "You shall love your neighbor as your neighbor loves you," I would have no objection. There is a second commandment that seems to me even more inconceivable and that arouses in me a more violent resistance: "You shall love your enemies." However, thinking about it, I see that I am wrong to reject it as an even less admissible claim, since, basically, it tells us the same thing as the first one. Arrived here, I think I hear a voice that, full of solemnity, warns me, precisely because your neighbor does not deserve your love and is rather your enemy, you must love him as yourself. I understand then that this is a case similar to the credo quia absurdum. Now, it is very probable that my neighbor, if invited to love me as myself, would respond exactly as I did, repudiating me for the same reasons, although, as I hope, not with the same objective right, but he, in turn, will expect the same. However, there are certain differences in the behavior of men, qualified by ethics as good and bad, without taking into account their conditions of origin. As long as these undeniable discrepancies have not been overcome, compliance with the supreme ethical precepts will be detrimental to the purposes of culture by establishing a direct reward for evil. The memory of what happened in the French Parliament when the death penalty was being debated cannot be avoided here. A speaker had passionately advocated its abolition and received frantic applause, until a voice from the back of the room pronounced the following words: "What messieurs les assassins commence?" The hidden truth behind all this, which we would gladly deny, is that man is not a tender creature in need of love, who would only dare to defend himself if attacked, but, on the contrary, a being between whose dispositions instinctive actions must also include a good portion of aggressiveness. Consequently, your neighbor is not only a possible collaborator and sexual object, but also a source of temptation to satisfy his aggressiveness, to exploit his ability to work without paying it, to take advantage of him sexually without his consent, to seize his property, to humiliate him, to cause him suffering, to martyr him and kill him. Homo homini lupus, who would dare to refute the saying, after all the experiences of life and history? As a rule, this cruel aggression waits to be provoked, or is put to the service of other purposes, the end of which could also be achieved by less violent means. Under conditions that are favorable to it, when the antagonistic psychic forces that generally inhibit it disappear, it can also manifest itself spontaneously, exposing man as a wild beast that does not know the world. Less respect for beings of their own kind. Whoever remembers the horrors of the great migrations, of the invasions of the Huns, of the Mughals under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, of the conquest of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders and even the cruelties of the last World War, will have to bow humbly before the reality of this conception. The existence of such aggressive tendencies, which we can perceive in ourselves and whose existence we rightly assume in others, is the factor that disturbs our relationship with our peers, imposing such a display of precepts on culture. Because of this primordial hostility between men, civilized society is constantly on the brink of disintegration. The interest offered by the work community would not be enough to maintain its cohesion, since instinctive passions are more powerful than rational interests. Culture is forced to make multiple efforts to put barriers to man's aggressive tendencies, to control their manifestations through psychic reaction formations. Hence, then, this display of methods intended for men to identify themselves and establish amorous ties that are restricted in their end, hence the restrictions on sexual life, and hence also the ideal precept of loving one's neighbor as oneself, a precept that is effectively justified, because no one else is, like him, so contrary and antagonistic to primitive human nature. However, all the efforts of culture aimed at imposing it have not yet achieved much. The former hopes to avoid the worst displays of brute force by granting herself the right to use force against criminals, but the law does not reach the most discreet and subtle manifestations of human aggressiveness. At a certain moment, we all came to abandon, like illusions, all the youthful hopes we had placed in our neighbor. We all have the experience of verifying how its wickedness embitters us and makes life difficult. However, it would be unfair to reproach culture for trying to exclude struggle and competition from human activities. Those factors are surely essential, but rivalry does not necessarily mean hostility, it is only abused to justify it. The communists believe they have discovered the path to redemption from evil. According to them, man would be good with all his heart, he would harbor the best intentions towards his neighbor, but the institution of private property would have corrupted his nature. The private possession of goods grants power to some, and with it the temptation to abuse others. Those excluded from property must rise up hostilely against their oppressors. If private property were abolished, if all goods were made common, allowing everyone to participate in their benefits, ill will and hostility between human beings would disappear. Since all needs would be satisfied, no one would have reason to see their neighbor as an enemy, all would willingly submit to the necessity of the work. I am not concerned with the economic critique of the communist system. It is not possible for me to investigate whether the abolition of private property is opportune and convenient, but, on the other hand, I can recognize his psychological hypothesis as a vain illusion. It is true that by abolishing private property one of its instruments is removed from human aggressiveness, a very strong one, no doubt, but by no means the strongest of all. However, nothing will have changed with this in the differences in power and influence that aggressiveness takes advantage of for its purposes, nor will its essence have changed. The aggressive instinct is not a consequence of property, but ruled almost without restraint in primitive times. When property was still very little, it already manifests itself in the child. As soon as the property has lost its primitive anal form, it constitutes the sediment of all the affectionate and loving ties between men, perhaps with the sole exception of the love that the mother feels for her son. If the personal right to possess material goods were eliminated, the privileges derived from sexual relations would still subsist, which must necessarily become a source of the most intense envy and the most violent hostility among human beings, equaled in everything else. If this privilege were also abolished, decreeing the complete freedom of sexual life, thus suppressing the family, the germinal cell of culture, then, it is true, it would be impossible to predict what new paths its evolution would follow, but whatever they were, we can accept that the inexhaustible tendencies intrinsic to human nature would not fail to follow them either. Obviously, it is not easy for a man to give up the satisfaction of these aggressive tendencies of his. He feels nothing at ease without that satisfaction. On the other hand, a more restricted cultural nucleus offers the very appreciable advantage of allowing the satisfaction of this instinct through hostility towards beings that have been excluded from it. A greater number of men can always be lovingly linked to each other, on the condition that there are others on whom to unleash the blows. On a certain occasion I dealt with the phenomenon that neighboring communities, and even related ones, are precisely the ones that fight and disdain each other the most, such as, for example, Spanish and Portuguese, North and South Germans, English and Scottish, etc. I have called this phenomenon small difference narcissism, although the term does little to explain it. We can consider it as a means to comfortably and more or less harmlessly satisfy aggressive tendencies, thus facilitating cohesion among the members of the community. The Jewish people, disseminated throughout the world, have earned in such a way important merits in terms of the development of the culture of the peoples that host it. Unfortunately, even the massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages did not make that time any more peaceful and secure for their Christian contemporaries. Once the Apostle Paul had made the universal love for humanity the foundation of the Christian community, the most extreme intolerance of Christianity towards Gentiles arose as an unavoidable consequence. On the other hand, the Romans, whose state organization was not based on love, were unaware of religious intolerance, despite the fact that among them religion was a matter of the state and the state was saturated with religion. Nor was it by incomprehensible chance that the dream of German world supremacy recurred as a complement to the incitement to anti-Semitism. Finally, it seems quite understandable to us that the attempt to establish a new communist culture in Russia resorts to the persecution of the bourgeoisie as psychological support. But we ask ourselves with concern, what will the Soviets do once they have totally exterminated their bourgeoisie? If culture imposes such heavy sacrifices, not only to sexuality, but also to aggressive tendencies, we will better understand why it is so difficult for man to achieve his happiness in it. Indeed, primitive man was less burdened in this sense, since he knew of no restriction of his instincts. On the other hand, there prospects of being able to enjoy such happiness for a long time. Civilized man has exchanged a part of possible happiness for a part of security, but let us not forget that in the primitive family only the head enjoyed such freedom of instincts, while the others lived oppressed as slaves. Consequently, the contradiction between a minority that enjoyed the privileges of culture and a majority excluded from these was most exalted in that primitive age of culture. The detailed investigations carried out with today's primitive peoples have shown us that the freedom they enjoy in their instinctive life is in no way enviable, since this is subject to restrictions of another order, perhaps even more severe than those suffered by civilized man. Modern. If with all justification we reproach the current state of our culture for how insufficiently it fulfills our claim to a life system that makes us happy, if we blame him for the magnitude of the suffering, perhaps avoidable, to which he exposes us, if we try to unmask the roots of its imperfection with relentless criticism, we are surely exercising our legitimate right, and we are not thereby showing ourselves to be enemies of culture. It is to be hoped that little by little we will be able to impose modifications on our culture that better satisfy our needs and that escape those critics. But perhaps we should also familiarize ourselves with the idea that there are difficulties inherent in the very essence of culture and inaccessible to any attempt at reform. In addition to the necessary instinctive limitation that we are already ready to accept, we are threatened by the danger of a state that we could call psychological misery of the masses. This danger is most imminent when the social forces of cohesion consist primarily of mutual identifications among the individuals of a group, while the leading figures do not assume the important role they should play in the formation of the mass. The present cultural situation in the United States would offer a good opportunity to study this fearful danger that threatens culture, but I avoid the temptation to address the criticism of American culture, because I do not want to create the impression that I intend to apply, in turn, American methods. None of my works have produced me, as intensely as this, the impression of describing things known to all, of wasting paper and ink, of employing typographers and printers to state facts that are really self-evident. That is why I enthusiastically approach the possibility of a modification of the psychoanalytic theory of instincts, by considering the existence of an aggressive, particular, and independent instinct. However, the considerations that follow will show that my hope is vain, that it only tries to capture with greater precision a theoretical shift already made some time ago, pursuing it to its ultimate consequences. Among all the notions gradually developed by analytic theory, the doctrine of the instincts is the one that gave rise to the most arduous and laborious progress. However, it represents such an essential piece in the whole of psychoanalytic theory that it was necessary to fill its place with any element. In the utter bewilderment of my initial studies, I was offered a first point of support by the aphorism of Schiller, the poet-philosopher, according to which hunger and love coherently make the world go round. He could well regard hunger as representing those instincts which tend to preserve the individual. Love, on the other hand, tends towards objects. Its primordial function, favored in every way by nature, resides in the conservation of the species. Thus from the very beginning the ego instincts and the object instincts stood in opposition to each other. To designate the energy of the latter, and exclusively for it, I introduced the term libido. With this the polarity was raised between the ego instincts and the libidinal instincts, directed towards objects, or amorous impulses in the broadest sense. However, one of these object instincts, the sadistic one, was distinguished from the others because its purpose was in no way loving, and it also established multiple and evident coalitions with the ego instincts, manifesting its close relationship with possession or appropriation drives, devoid of libidinal purposes. But this discrepancy could be overcome. Clearly, sadism is part of sexual life, and it may well happen that the game of cruelty replaces that of love. Neurosis came to be the solution to a struggle between the interests of self-preservation and the demands of the libido, a fight in which the self, although triumphant, had paid the price of serious suffering and sacrifice. Every analyst will recognize that even today none of this seems like an error long since overcome. But when our investigation progressed from the repressed to the repressor, from the object instincts to the ego, it was necessary to make a certain modification. The decisive factor in this progress was the introduction of the concept of narcissism, that is, the recognition that the ego is also permeated with libido, even more, that primitively the self was its place of origin and in a certain way continues to be its central headquarters. This narcissistic libido is oriented towards objects, thus becoming object libido, but it can turn back into narcissistic libido. The concept of narcissism allowed us to understand analytically the traumatic neuroses, as well as many conditions bordering on psychosis and even psychosis itself. Its adoption did not compel us to abandon the interpretation of transference neuroses as attempts by the ego to defend itself against sexuality, but, instead, he jeopardized the concept of the libido. Since ego instincts also turned out to be libidinal, it seemed for a moment inevitable that libido would become synonymous with instinctual energy in general, as C.G. Jung had previously claimed. However, this conception did not quite satisfy me, since I had a certain intimate conviction, unprovable, that instincts could not all be of the same species. I took the next step forward in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, when for the first time my attention was aroused by the impulse to repeat and by the conservative nature of the instinctive life. Starting from certain speculations about the origin of life and about certain biological parallelisms, I deduced that, in addition to the instinct that tends to preserve the living substance and condense it into larger and larger units, there must be another, antagonistic to it, that tends to dissolve these units and return them to the most primitive, inorganic state. So that in addition to eros there would be a death instinct. Vital phenomena could be explained by the interaction and antagonism of both. But it was not easy to demonstrate the activity of this hypothetical death instinct. The manifestations of eros were remarkable and quite conspicuous. It could well be admitted that the death instinct acted silently in the depths of the living being, pursuing its disintegration, but this, of course, did not have the value of a demo. I made some further progress, accepting that a part of this instinct is directed against the outside world, manifesting itself then as an impulse for aggression and destruction. In this way, the death instinct itself would be placed at the service of eros, since the living being would destroy something external, animate or inanimate, instead of destroying itself. On the contrary, when this aggression against the outside ceases, self-destruction would necessarily increase, a process that is constantly operating anyway. At the same time, it could be deduced from this example that both kinds of instincts seldom, or perhaps never, appear in mutual isolation, but that they amalgamate with each other in different and highly variable proportions, thus becoming unrecognizable to us. In sadism, long accepted as a partial instinct of sexuality, we would find such a particularly solid amalgamation between the amorous impulse and the destructive instinct. The same happens with its antagonistic simile, masochism, which represents an amalgamation between inward-directed destruction and sexuality, through which that destructive tendency, otherwise inappreciable, becomes noticeable or perceptible. Acceptance of the death or destruction instinct has aroused resistance even in analytic circles. I know that many prefer to attribute everything that seems dangerous and hostile in love to a primordial bipolarity inherent in the essence of love itself. At the beginning I only proposed as a tentative the conceptions presented here, but in the course of time they imposed themselves on me with such force of conviction that I can no longer think otherwise. I believe that for the theory of these conceptions they are much more fruitful than any other possible hypothesis, since they offer us that simplification that we pursue in our scientific work, without disdaining or violating the objective facts. I realize that we have always kept in mind in sadism and masochism the manifestations of the destructive instinct directed outwards and inwards, strongly amalgamated with eroticism, but I no longer understand how it was possible for us to overlook the ubiquity of non-erotic aggressive and destructive tendencies by failing to give them the importance they deserve in the interpretation of life. It is true that the inwardly directed destructive impulse generally escapes perception when it is not erotically tinged. I remember my own resistance when the idea of the destructive instinct appeared for the first time. First in the psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took me to accept it. I am much less surprised that others have shown the same aversion, and still do, for those who believe in fairy tales do not like to hear mention of man's innate inclination toward evil, toward aggression, destruction, and with it also to cruelty. Did not God create us in the image of His own perfection? For that is why no one wants to be reminded how difficult it is to reconcile the existence of evil, undeniable, despite all the protests of Christian science, with the omnipotence and sovereign goodness of God. The devil would still be the best subterfuge to excuse God, since he would perform the same economic discharge function that the Jew fulfills in the world of Aryan ideals. But even so, God could be asked to account for both the existence of the devil and the evil that he incarnates. Faced with such difficulties, it is convenient to advise everyone to pay profound reverence, on all occasions, to the essentially moral nature of man. In this way general favor is gained and many things are forgiven. The term libido can continue to be applied to the manifestations of eros in order to distinguish them from the energy inherent in the death instinct. It must be confessed that it is much more difficult for us to capture the latter and that, in a certain way, we only conjecture it as a kind of residue or remnant hidden behind eros, eluding our observation whenever it does not manifest itself in the amalgamation with it. In sadism, where the erotic purpose is diverted in its own way and convenience, without ceasing to satisfy the sexual impulse, we achieve the clearest knowledge of its essence and its relationship with eros. But even where it appears without sexual purposes, even in the blindest destructive fury, one cannot fail to recognize that its satisfaction is accompanied by extraordinary narcissistic pleasure, since it offers the ego the fulfillment of its most archaic desires for omnipotence. Attenuated and subdued, almost restricted in its end, the destructive instinct directed towards objects must provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and dominion over nature. Since, in fact, we have resorted mainly to theoretical arguments to support the death instinct, we must concede that it is not free from objections of the same nature, but, in any case, such is how we consider it in the present state of our knowledge. Future research and speculation will surely provide us with the decisive clarity on this point. In all that follows I will therefore adopt the point of view that the aggressive tendency is an innate and autonomous instinctive disposition of the human being. Furthermore, I now return to my statement that it constitutes the greatest obstacle that culture encounters. In the course of this investigation, the intuition that culture would be a particular process that develops on humanity was once imposed on us, and even now this idea subjugates us. We will add that it is a process placed at the service of eros, destined to condense isolated individuals into a vast unit in humanity, then families, tribes, towns, and nations. We do not know why it must be so, we accept that it is simply the work of eros. These human masses must be linked libidinally, since neither necessity alone nor the advantages of the work community would be enough to keep them together. But the natural human instinct for aggression, the hostility of one against all and of all against one, opposes this design of culture. Said aggression instinct is the descendant and main representative of the death instinct, which we have found together with eros and which shares domination of the world with it. Now, I think, the meaning of cultural evolution will no longer be impenetrable to us, it must necessarily present to us the struggle between eros and death, the instinct for life and the instinct for destruction, as it takes place in the human species. This struggle is, in short, its essential content, and for this reason cultural evolution can be briefly defined as the struggle of the human species for life. And it is this combat of the titans that our mothers try to appease in their Aurora from heaven. 7. Why don't our relatives, the animals, put up such a cultural struggle? Well, we don't know. It is very probable that some, like bees, ants and termites, have struggled for millennia to reach the state organizations, the distribution of work, the limitation of individual freedom that we admire in them today. Our present cultural situation is well characterized by the circumstance that, according to our feelings, we could not be happy in any of these animal states, nor in any of the functions that are conferred on the individual there. It may be that other animal species have reached a temporary balance between the influences of the outside world and the instincts that fight each other, thus producing an arrest of development. It is possible that in primitive man a new impulse of the libido has renewed the antagonistic impulse of the instinct of destruction. Many questions remain here to be formulated, without yet being able to give them an answer. But there is a question that is more within our reach. To what resources does the culture appeal to limit the aggression that is antagonistic to it, to make it harmless and perhaps to eliminate it? We already know some of these methods, but surely we are still ignorant of the one that seems to be the most important. We can study it in the evolutionary history of the individual. What has happened to him to make his aggressive desires harmless? Something extremely curious, that we would never have suspected and that, however, is very natural. The aggression is introjected, internalized, returned in reality to the place where it came from. It is directed against one's own ego, incorporating itself into a part of it, which as a superego opposes the remaining part, and assuming the function of consciousness, displays in front of the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would gladly have satisfied in strange individuals. The tension created between the severe superego and the subordinated ego we describe as a feeling of guilt. It manifests itself in the form of the need for punishment. Consequently, the culture dominates the dangerous aggressive inclination of the individual, weakening him, disarming him and making him watch over an instance housed within him, like a military garrison in a conquered city. The psychoanalyst has a different opinion about the genesis of the feeling of guilt than that held by other psychologists, but it is not easy for him to explain it either. First of all, asking how one comes to experience this feeling, we obtain an answer to which there is no possible reply. One feels guilty, believers say in sin, when something that is considered bad has been committed, but we will point out the parsimony of this answer. Perhaps we will add, after a few hesitations, that he can also be considered guilty who has not done anything wrong, but only recognizes in himself the intention to do it, and in such a case the question will be raised why the purpose is here equated with the realization. But both cases presuppose that evil has already been recognized as something reprehensible, as something to be excluded from being carried out. But how is this decision reached? We can reject the existence of an original faculty, in a certain natural way, to discern good from evil. Many times what is bad is not even what is harmful or dangerous for the self, but, on the contrary, something that it desires and that gives it pleasure. Here, then, an alien and external influence is manifested, destined to establish what should be considered good and bad. Since man has not been led by his own sensitivity to such discrimination, he must have some reason to subordinate himself to this foreign influence. We can easily find him in his helplessness and his dependence on others. The denomination that best suits him is that of fear of losing love. When man loses the love of his neighbor, on whom he depends, he thereby loses his protection against many dangers, and above all he exposes himself to the risk that this neighbor, more powerful than him, demonstrates his superiority in the form of punishment. Thus, the bad is, originally, that for which one is threatened with the loss of love. Committing it should be avoided for fear of this loss. That is why it does not matter much if we have really done wrong or if we only intend to do it. In both cases the danger will only appear when the authority has discovered it, and it would adopt a similar attitude in either case. We call such a state bad conscience, but deep down that name does not suit it, because at this level the feeling of guilt is, without a doubt, more than a fear of losing love, that is, anguish social. In the small child it can never be anything else, but neither does it change in many adults, with the exception that the place of the father or of both parental characters is occupied by the vastest human community. That is why adults regularly allow themselves to do any evil that offers them advantages, as long as they are sure that the authority will not discover them or will not be able to do anything to them, so that their fear refers exclusively to the possibility of being discovered. In general, today's society is forced to accept this state of affairs. Fundamental change only occurs when authority is internalized by establishing a superego. With this, the phenomena of moral conscience are elevated to a new level, and only then is there the right to speak of moral conscience and feelings of guilt. In this phase, the fear of being discovered and the difference between doing and wanting evil also cease to act, since nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. It is true that the real seriousness of the situation has disappeared, since the new authority, the superego, does not, in our opinion, have any reason to mistreat the ego, with which it is intimately fused. But the influence of its genesis, which makes the past and the superseded endure, is manifested by the fact that ultimately everything remains as it was at the beginning. The superego tortures the sinful self with the same feelings of anguish and is on the lookout for opportunities to get it punished by the outside world. In this second evolutionary phase, moral conscience denotes a particularity that was missing in the first and that is no longer so easy to explain. Indeed, the more virtuous man is, he behaves all the more severely and suspiciously, so that, ultimately, those who have gone the furthest along the path of holiness are precisely those who accuse themselves of the worst sinfulness. Virtue thus loses a part of the reward promised to it. The submissive and austere self does not enjoy the trust of his mentor and strives, apparently in vain, to win it. Here it will be argued that these would only be difficulties artificially created by us, since the moral man is characterized precisely by his most severe and vigilant moral conscience, and if the saints accuse themselves of being sinners, they do not do so without reason, bearing in mind consider the temptations to satisfy their instincts to which they are exposed to a particular degree, since, as is well known, the temptation only increases in intensity under constant privations, while being granted occasional satisfactions, it is attenuated, at least temporarily. Another fact of the field of ethics, so rich in problems, is that adversity, that is, external frustration, enormously intensifies the power of consciousness in the superego. While luck smiles on man, his moral conscience is indulgent and grants great liberties to the self. On the other hand, when misfortune hits him, he examines his conscience, acknowledges his sins, raises the demands of his moral conscience, imposes privations and is punishable by penalties. Entire peoples have behaved and still continue to behave in the same way, but this attitude is easily explained by going back to the primitive infantile phase of consciousness, which, as we see, is not completely abandoned once authority is introjected into the superego, but subsists alongside it. The destination is considered as a substitute for the parent instance. If misfortune strikes us, it means that we are no longer loved by this highest authority, and threatened by such a loss of love, we once again submit to the representative of the parents in the superego, whom we had tried to disdain when we enjoyed happiness. All this is revealed with particular clarity when, in the strict religious sense, one sees in destiny nothing but an expression of the divine will. The people of Israel considered themselves the Lord's favorite son, and when this great Father made them suffer misfortune after misfortune, they in no way came to doubt that privileged relationship with God or his power and justice, but created the prophets, who were to reproaching him for his sinfulness, and he made arise from his feeling of guilt the most severe precepts of the priestly religion. It is curious, but how differently primitive man behaves. When a misfortune has happened to him, he blames it not on himself, but on the fetish, which obviously hasn't fulfilled its purpose, and he beats it to the ground instead of punishing himself. Consequently, we know of two origins of the feeling of guilt. One is the fear of authority, the second, more recent, is the fear of the superego. The first obliges to renounce the satisfaction of the instincts, the second also encourages punishment, since it is not possible to hide from the superego the persistence of prohibited desires. On the other hand, we already know how the severity of the superego is to be understood, that is, the rigor of moral conscience. This simply continues the severity of the external authority, revealing it and partly replacing it. We now notice the relationship that exists between the renunciation of instincts and the feeling of guilt. Originally, instinctual renunciation is a consequence of fear of external authority. Satisfaction is renounced so as not to lose its love. Once that resignation has been fulfilled, the accounts with said authority have been settled and no longer any feeling of guilt should subsist. But the same does not happen with the fear of the superego. Here the renunciation of the satisfaction of the instincts is not enough, since the corresponding desire persists and cannot be hidden from the superego. Consequently, the feeling of guilt will not stop arising, despite the resignation fulfilled, a circumstance that represents a great economic disadvantage of the establishment of the superego or, in other words, of the genesis of moral conscience. The instinctual resignation no longer has full absolving effect, virtuous abstinence is no longer rewarded with the security of preserving love, and the individual has exchanged a threatening external catastrophe, loss of love and punishment by external authority, for a permanent internal misfortune, the tension of the feeling of guilt. These interrelationships are so complex and at the same time so important that at the risk of incurring repetitions I would still like to approach them from another angle. The chronological sequence would be, then, the following. First of all, an instinctive renunciation is produced for fear of the aggression of the external authority, since this is what the fear of losing love is reduced to, since love protects against punitive aggression. Then internal authority is established, with the consequent instinctual renunciation for fear of it, that is, by the fear of moral conscience. In the second case, the bad action is equated with the malevolent intention, so that the feeling of guilt and the need for punishment appear. Aggression by moral conscience thus perpetuates aggression by authority. So far everything is very clear, but, where to locate in this scheme the reinforcement of the moral conscience by influence of external adversities, that is to say, of the resignations imposed from outside? How to explain the extraordinary intensity of consciousness in the best and most docile beings? We have already explained both particularities of moral conscience, but perhaps we have the impression that these explanations do not get to the bottom of the matter, but leave a rest unexplained. Here the time has come to introduce an idea entirely proper to psychoanalysis and foreign to common thinking. The statement of this idea will allow us to understand at once why the subject should seem so confusing and impenetrable to us. Indeed, tells us that although at first moral conscience, more precisely, anxiety, later converted into consciousness, is the cause of the renunciation of the instincts, later, on the other hand, this situation is reversed. All instinctual renunciation then becomes a dynamic source of moral conscience. Every new renunciation of satisfaction increases its severity and its intolerance. If we were able to better reconcile this situation with the genesis of moral conscience that we already know, we would be tempted to support the following thesis. Paradoxical, moral conscience is the consequence of instinctual renunciation, or else, the instinctual renunciation, which has been imposed on us from outside, creates moral conscience, which in turn demands new instinctual renunciations. In reality, the contradiction between this thesis and the described genesis of moral conscience is not so great, being able to glimpse a path that will allow it to be further restricted. In order to pose the problem more easily, let us use the example of the aggressive instinct and accept that in these relationships it must always be a question of a renunciation of aggression. Of course, this will only be a provisional hypothesis. In such a case, the effect of the instinctual renunciation on the moral conscience would be based on the fact that each part of the aggression whose compliance we renounce is incorporated by the superego, increasing its aggressiveness against the ego. This proposition does not agree perfectly with the fact that the original aggressiveness of the moral conscience is a continuation of the severity with which the external authority acts, that is to say, that it has nothing to do with a resignation, but we can eliminate such a discrepancy by accepting a different origin for this first supply of superego aggressiveness. This must have developed considerable aggressive tendencies against the authority that deprived the child of his first and most important satisfactions, whatever may have been the particular species of instinctual renunciations imposed by that authority. Under the rule of necessity, the child was forced to renounce this vengeful aggression as well, escaping himself from such a difficult economic situation. Through the recourse offered to him by known mechanisms, he incorporates, by identifying with it, this inaccessible authority, which then it becomes a superego and takes over all the aggressiveness that the child would have gladly displayed against it. The child's self must accommodate itself to the sad role of the authority thus degraded, the father. It is, as on so many occasions, a typical inverted situation. If I were the father and you were the child, I would treat you badly. The relationship between the superego and the ego is the return, distorted by desire, of old real relations between the ego, still undivided, and an external object, a fact that is also typical. The fundamental difference resides, however, in that the primitive severity of the superego is not or is not to such an extent what the object has made us feel or what we attribute to it, but corresponds more to our own aggression against the object. Object. If this is accurate, it can really be said that consciousness would have primitively formed by the suppression of an aggression, and that in its development would be strengthened by new similar suppressions. Now, which of these two conceptions is the true one? The first, which seemed so well founded genetically, or the second, which comes to complete our theory so opportunely? Obviously, both are justified, as direct observation also shows. They do not contradict each other and even agree on one point, for the child's vengeful aggressiveness is to be determined in part by the extent of the punitive aggression he attributes to the father. But experience teaches us that the severity of the superego developed by the child in no way reflects the severity of the treatment that he has been made to experience. The first seems to be independent of the latter, since a very mildly educated child can develop an extremely severe moral conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to be convinced that the rigor of education also exerts a powerful influence on the genesis of the infantile superego. It happens that the formation of the superego and the development of the moral conscience concur innate constitutional factors and influences of the environment, of the real environment, a duality that is not at all strange since it represents the general etiological condition of all these processes. It can also be said that the child, when he reacts to the first great instinctual privations with excessive aggression and with a corresponding severity of the superego, does nothing but repeat a phylogenetic prototype, exceeding the current justification of the reaction. Since the prehistoric father, it was certainly terrible and the most extreme aggressiveness could rightfully be attributed to him. The divergences between both conceptions of the genesis of moral conscience are attenuated, then, even more if one passes from individual evolutionary history to phylogenetics. Instead, we are presented with a new and important difference between these two processes. We cannot avoid the assumption that the feeling of guilt in the human species stems from the Oedipus complex and was acquired when the father was murdered by the coalition of brothers. On that occasion, the aggression was not suppressed, but executed, the same aggression that, when alibi, must give rise to a feeling of guilt in the child. Now I would not be surprised if one of my readers exclaimed angrily, "So it doesn't matter if you kill the father or if you don't kill him, because we'll create a feeling of guilt anyway." Well, one can afford some doubts. Either it is false that the feeling of guilt comes from suppressed aggressions, or the whole story of parricide is nothing more than a tale, and the children of primitive men did not kill their parents more often than modern men usually do. On the other hand, if it is not a story, but acceptable historical truth, then we would only be faced with a case in which what everyone expects happens, that one feels guilty for having really done something unjustified. And this case, which after all happens every day, is the one that psychoanalysis fails to explain. Nothing is more certain than this lack, but we must hasten to remedy it. On the other hand, it is not a question of any special mystery. If someone has a feeling of guilt after having committed some fault, and precisely because of it, such a feeling should be called, rather, remorse. It only refers to a given fact, and naturally it presupposes that before it there was a disposition to feel guilty, that is, a moral conscience, so that such remorse can never help us to find the origin of moral conscience and feeling of guilt in general. In these everyday cases it usually happens that an instinctual need has acquired the necessary force to impose its satisfaction against the energy, also limited, of the moral conscience, re-establishing the primitive relationship of forces through the natural attenuation that the instinctual need experiences when it is satisfied. Consequently, psychoanalysis does well to exclude from these considerations the case that represents the feeling of guilt emanating from remorse, despite the frequency with which it appears and despite the magnitude of its practical importance. But if the human feeling of guilt goes back to the murder of the proto-father, wasn't it also a case of remorse, even if then the precondition of moral conscience and feeling of guilt prior to the fact could not have been given? Where does the remorse come from in that situation? This case will surely clarify for us the enigma of the feeling of guilt, putting an end to our difficulties. Indeed, I think it will fulfill our hopes. This remorse was the result of the very primitive affective ambivalence towards the father, since the children hated him, but they also loved him. Once the hatred was satisfied through the aggression, the love reappeared in the remorse following the fact, erecting the superego by identification with the father, endowing it with the power of the latter, as if with this it wanted to punish the aggression that was done to it. Suffer, and finally establishing the restrictions aimed at preventing the repetition of the crime. And since the aggressive tendency against the father was agitated again in each successive generation, the feeling of guilt also remained, strengthening anew with each of the aggressions contained and transferred to the superego. I think that we will finally understand two things clearly: the participation of love in the genesis of consciousness and the inevitability of the feeling of guilt. Indeed, it is not decisive whether we have killed the father or whether we abstained from the act. In both cases we will necessarily feel guilty, since this feeling of guilt is the expression of the conflict of ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and instinct. Destruction or death. This conflict is exacerbated when the task of living in community is imposed on man. As long as this community only adopts the form of the family, the former will manifest itself in the Oedipus complex, instituting consciousness and engendering the first feeling of guilt. When attempts are made to expand such a community, the same conflict persists in ways that depend on the past, further reinforcing and exalting the feeling of guilt. Given that culture obeys an internal erotic drive that forces it to unite men in an intimately amalgamated mass, it can only achieve this goal through the constant and progressive accentuation of the feeling of guilt. The process that began in relation to the father ends in relation to the mass. If culture is the inescapable path that leads from the family to humanity, then, as a result of the innate conflict of ambivalence, because of the eternal quarrel between the love tendency and the death tendency, culture is inextricably linked with an exaltation of the feeling of guilt, which may reach a degree that is difficult for the individual to bear. Here comes to mind the moving imprecation that the great poet directs against the celestial powers. You throw us into life, letting the poor incur guilt, then you let him suffer. For all guilt must be expiated. We cannot help but sigh inconsolably when we see how certain men are able to make the most profound knowledge arise without any effort from the whirlwind of their own feelings, while we, to reach them, must make our way through tortuous hesitations and uncertain gropings. 8. Arrived at the end of such an excursion, the author must apologize to his readers for not having been a more skillful guide, for not having spared them the arid stretches or the difficult detours on the road. There is no doubt that the same goal can be better achieved. As far as it depends on me, I will try to compensate some of these defects. First of all, I suspect that I have aroused in the reader the impression that the considerations on the feeling of guilt exceed the limits of this work, occupying too much space alone, relegating to the background all the remaining themes, with which they are not always intimately linked. This may well have upset the structure of my study, but it is entirely in keeping with the purpose of highlighting guilt as the most important problem of cultural evolution, pointing out that the price paid for the progress of culture lies in the loss of happiness for increased feeling of guilt. What still seems strange in this proposition, the final result of our study, can perhaps be attributed to the very strange and still completely unexplained relationship between the feeling of guilt and our conscience. In common cases of remorse that we consider normal, that feeling is expressed clearly enough in consciousness, and we even tend to say, instead of guilty feeling, schuldgefühl, guilt consciousness, Schuldbewusstsein. The study of neuroses, to which we owe the most valuable Information for the understanding of the normal reveals very contradictory situations. In one of these affections, obsessional neurosis, the feeling of guilt imposes itself on consciousness with excessive intensity, dominating both the clinical picture and the entire life of the patient, hardly allowing other things to emerge along with it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis, the feeling of guilt remains entirely unconscious, without its effects being less intense for this. The sick do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious feeling of guilt to them. In order for them to understand us, even if only in part, we explain to them that the feeling of guilt is expressed by an unconscious need for punishment. But we must not overestimate its relationship with the form that a neurosis takes, since there are also certain types of patients in obsessive neurosis who do not perceive their feeling of guilt, or who only manage to feel it as a tormenting malaise, as a kind of anguish, when they are prevented from performing certain acts. No doubt it would be necessary to finally understand all this, but we have not yet reached that far. Perhaps it should be noted here that the feeling of guilt is, basically, nothing more than a topographical variant of anxiety, and that in its later phases it coincides completely with the fear of the superego. On the other hand, in its relation to consciousness, anxiety presents the same extraordinary variations that we observe in the feeling of guilt. In one way or another, there is always anguish hidden behind all the symptoms, but while on certain occasions it noisily monopolizes the entire field of consciousness, on others it is hidden to such an extent that we are forced to speak of unconscious anguish or to appease our psychological scruples. Since anguish is not, in principle, but a sensation, we will talk about possibilities of distress. For this reason it is also easy to conceive that the feeling of guilt engendered by culture is not perceived as such, but rather remains largely unconscious or is expressed as a malaise, a discontent that one tries to attribute to other motivations. Religions, at least, have never failed to recognize the importance of the feeling of guilt for culture, calling it sin and claiming to rid humanity of it, an aspect that I omitted to consider on a certain occasion. Instead, in another work I based myself precisely on the way in which Christianity obtains this redemption, by the sacrificial death of an individual, who thus assumes the guilt common to all, to deduce from it the occasion on which this original proto-guilt may have been acquired for the first time, an occasion that would also have been the origin of culture. Perhaps it is not superfluous, although it is not very important either, that we illustrate the meaning of some terms such as superego, conscience, feeling of guilt, need for punishment, remorse, terms that we have probably applied with some negligence and in mutual confusion. They all relate to the same situation, but denote different aspects of it. The superego is a psychic instance inferred by us, conscience is one of the functions that we attribute to it, along with others. It is destined to monitor the acts and intentions of the self, judging them and exercising a sensorial activity. The feeling of guilt, the severity of the superego, is equivalent, then, to the rigor of conscience. It is the perception that the ego has of this vigilance that is imposed on it. It is its appreciation of the tensions between its own tendencies and the demands of the superego. Finally, the anguish underlying all these relationships, the fear of this critical instance, that is, the need for punishment, is an instinctive manifestation of the ego that has become masochistic under the influence of the sadistic superego. In other words, it is a part of the impulse towards internal destruction that the ego possesses and that it uses to establish an erotic bond with the superego. One should never speak of conscience until the existence of a superego has been demonstrated. On the other hand, the feeling or consciousness of guilt can be accepted as existing before the superego and, consequently, also before moral conscience. It is then the direct and immediate expression of fear before external authority, the recognition of the tension between the self and the latter. It is the direct product of the conflict between the need for parental love and the tendency for instinctual gratification, the inhibition of which engenders aggression. The superimposition of these two planes of the feeling of guilt, the one derived from the fear of external authority and the one produced by fear of internal authority, has often made it difficult for us to understand the relationships of moral conscience. Remorse is a comprehensive term used to designate the ego's reaction to a special case of guilt feeling, including the almost unaltered sensitive material of anxiety acting behind it. It is itself a punishment, and may encompass the whole need for punishment. Consequently, remorse can also be prior to the development of moral conscience. Nor will it be superfluous to go over again the contradictions that at times have confused us in our study. Once we claimed that the feeling of guilt was a consequence of the alibi attacks, while in another case, precisely in its historical origin, in parricide, it had to be the result of an attack carried out. However, we also managed to overcome this obstacle, since the establishment of internal authority, of the superego, came to radically disrupt the situation. Before this change, the feeling of guilt coincided with remorse. We note here that this term should be reserved to designate the reaction following the actual fulfillment of the aggression. After it, the difference between intentional and actual aggression lost all importance due to the omni-knowledge of the superego. Now, the feeling of guilt could originate both in an act of violence actually carried out, something that everyone knows, as well as in a simply intentional one, a fact that psychoanalysis has discovered. Both before and after, regardless of this change in the psychological situation, the conflict of ambivalence between the two proto-instincts produces the same effect. We would be tempted to seek here the solution of the problem of the variable relations between the feeling of guilt and conscience. The feeling of guilt, emanating from remorse for a bad action, should always be conscious, while the derivative of the perception of the noxious impulse could remain unconscious. But things are not so simple, and obsessional neurosis fundamentally contradicts this scheme. We have seen that there is a second contradiction between both hypotheses regarding the origin of the aggressive energy that we suppose the superego is endowed with. Indeed, according to the first conception, it is nothing more than the continuation of the punitive energy of the external authority, conserving it in the psychic life, while according to the other it would represent, on the contrary, one's own aggressiveness, directed against that inhibitory authority. But not done. The first conception seems to be better adapted to the history of the feeling of guilt, while the second takes its theory more into account. Deepening the reflection, this antinomy, apparently irreconcilable, almost came to disappear excessively, since the fact that in both cases it is an aggression displaced inward remained as an essential and common element. On the other hand, clinical observation makes it possible to really differentiate between two sources of aggression attributed to the superego, one or the other of which may predominate in each individual case, although they generally work together. I think the time has come to formally insist on a conception that up to now I have proposed as a provisional hypothesis. In the most recent analytical literature, a predilection is expressed for the theory that any form of deprivation, any instinctual satisfaction disappointed, has, or could have as a consequence an increase in the feeling of guilt. For my part, I think that the theory is considerably simplified if this principle is applied only to aggressive instincts, and there is no doubt that there will be few facts that contradict this hypothesis. Indeed, how could one explain, dynamically and economically, that instead of an unsatisfied erotic demand there appears an increase in the feeling of guilt? This only seems to be possible through the following indirect derivation: preventing erotic satisfaction would unleash some aggressiveness against the person who prevents that satisfaction, and this aggressiveness would have to be contained in turn. But in such a case, it would only be the aggression again that transforms into a feeling of guilt by being alibi and derived from the superego. I am convinced that we will be able to conceive many psychic processes more simply and clearly if we limit the genesis of the feeling of guilt discovered by psychoanalysis to only aggressive instincts. The observation of the clinical material does not provide us with an unequivocal answer here, since, as our own hypotheses anticipated, both categories of instincts almost never appear in a pure form and in mutual isolation, but investigation of extreme cases will surely lead us in the direction I envision. I am tempted to immediately seize this narrower conception by applying it to the process of repression. As we already know, the symptoms of neurosis are essentially substitute gratifications of unrealized sexual desires. In the course of analytic work we have learned, to our great surprise, that perhaps every neurosis conceals a certain amount of unconscious guilt, which in turn reinforces the symptoms when used as punishment. The following proposition could therefore be formulated: when an instinctual impulse is repressed, its libidinal elements become symptoms, and its aggressive components, guilt feelings. Even if this proposition were only true as an approximation, it would well deserve our attention. On the other hand, many readers will have the impression that the formula of the struggle between eros and the death instinct has been mentioned excessively. I applied it to characterize the cultural process that takes place in humanity, but I also linked it to the evolution of the individual, and I also claimed that it would reveal the secret of organic life in general. It therefore seems unavoidable to investigate the mutual links between these three processes. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the consideration that both the cultural process of humanity and that of individual evolution are nothing more than vital mechanisms, so that they must participate in the more general character of life. But this very generality of the biological character detracts from any value as a differential element of the cultural process, unless it is limited by particular conditions in the case of the latter. In effect, we overcome this uncertainty by verifying that the cultural process is that modification of the vital process that arises under the influence of a task posed by eros and urged by an due to real external necessity, a task that consists in the unification of isolated individuals to form a libidinally linked community. But if we contemplate the relationship between the cultural process in humanity and that of individual development or education, we will not hesitate to recognize that both are very similar in nature, and that they could even represent the same process carried out on different objects. Naturally, the cultural process of the human species is an abstraction of a higher order than the evolution of the individual, and for this reason it is more difficult to capture it concretely. It is not convenient to exaggerate in an artificial way the establishment of such analogies, however, taking into account the similarity of the objectives of both processes in one case, the inclusion of an individual in the human mass, in the other, the creation of a collective unit from many individuals. The similarity of the methods applied and the results obtained cannot surprise us. But neither can we continue to hide a differential feature of both processes, since their importance is extraordinary. The evolution of the individual sustains as its main goal the program of the pleasure principle, that is, the pursuit of happiness, while inclusion in a human community or adaptation to it appears as an almost unavoidable requirement that must be fulfilled for achieve the goal of happiness, but perhaps it would be much better if this condition could be removed. In other words, individual evolution appears to us as the product of the interference between two tendencies, the aspiration to happiness, which we usually describe as selfish, and the desire to merge with others in a community, which we call altruistic. Both designations do not go beyond being superficial. As we have already said, in individual evolution the emphasis tends to fall on the egoistic or happiness tendency, while the other, which we could call cultural, is generally limited to establishing restrictions. Very different is what happens in the process of culture. The goal of establishing a unity made up of human individuals is by far the most important, while that of individual happiness, though still subsisting, is pushed into the background. It would almost seem that the creation of a great human community could be more successfully accomplished if individual happiness were abstracted from it. Consequently, it must be admitted that the evolutionary process of the individual may have particular features that are not found in the cultural process of humanity. The first will only coincide with the second to the extent that it has adaptation to the community as its goal. Just as the planet revolves around its central star, in addition to rotating around its own axis, the individual also participates in the evolutionary process of humanity, while at the same time following the path of his own life. But to our dull eyes the drama unfolding in the firmament seems to be fixed in undisturbed order. In organic phenomena, on the other hand, we still notice how forces struggle with each other and how the results of the conflict change incessantly. Just as the two antagonistic tendencies must inevitably be combated in each individual, that of individual happiness and that of human union, so too must the two evolutionary processes, that of the individual and that of culture, have to confront each other by force, disputing the ground. But this struggle between individual and society is not the result of an antagonism, perhaps irreconcilable, between the proto-instincts, between eros and death, but rather responds to a conflict in the economy of libido itself, a conflict comparable to the dispute over the distribution of libido between self and objects. Notwithstanding the hardships that the existence of the individual currently imposes, the struggle can reach a definitive balance within him that, as we hope, will also reach in the future of culture. The analogy between the cultural process and the evolution of the individual can be taken much further still, since it can be argued that the community also develops a superego under whose influence cultural evolution takes place. For the student of human cultures, it would be tempting to pursue this analogy in specific cases. For my part, I will limit myself to highlighting some notable details. The superego of a given cultural epoch has an origin analogous to that of the individual superego, since it is based on the impression left by great leading figures, men of overwhelming spiritual strength, or those in whom some of the human aspirations came to be expressed with maximum energy and purity, although, perhaps for that very reason, very unilaterally. In many cases the analogy goes even further, since with regular frequency, although not always, these characters have been denigrated, mistreated, or even ruthlessly eliminated by their peers, a similar fate to that of the proto-father, who only long after his violent death rises to the category of divinity. The figure of Jesus Christ is precisely the most complete example of such a double destiny, as long as it is not by chance a mythological creation that emerged under the dark memory of that primitive murder. Another coincidental element resides in the fact that the cultural superego, like the individual one, establishes rigid ideals whose violation is punished with the anguish of conscience. Here we find ourselves before the curious situation that the respective psychic processes are more familiar to us, more accessible to consciousness, when we approach them under their collective aspect than when we study them in the individual. In it, only the aggressions of the superego are loudly expressed, manifested as reproaches when internal tension rises, while its very demands often lie unconscious. By bringing them to conscious perception, it is verified that they coincide with the precepts of the respective cultural superego. Both processes, the cultural evolution of the mass and the development of the individual, are always here in a certain way conglomerated. For this reason, many expressions and qualities of the superego can be more easily recognized in their collective expression than in the isolated individual. The cultural superego has elaborated its ideals and erected its norms. Among these, those that refer to the relationships of human beings among themselves are included in the concept of ethics. At all times the highest value was placed on these ethical systems, as if precisely they were to fulfill the highest hopes. Indeed, ethics deals with that little cigar that is easy to recognize as the most vulnerable of all cultures. Therefore, it must be conceived as a therapeutic attempt, as an attempt to achieve through an imperative of the superego what previously could not achieve the other cultural work. We already know that in this sense the problem consists in eliminating the biggest obstacle that culture encounters, the constitutional tendency of men to mutually attack each other, hence the particular interest that perhaps the most recent precept of the cultural superego has for us: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The investigation and treatment of neuroses have led us to support two accusations against the individual superego: with the severity of its precepts and prohibitions, it is too careless about the happiness of the ego, since it does not take due account of the resistances against the fulfillment of those, of the instinctive energy of the ID, and of the difficulties that the real world offers. Consequently, in pursuing our therapeutic goal, we are often forced to fight the superego, striving to mitigate its claims. We can raise very similar objections against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. Nor does he care enough about the psychic constitution of man, since he institutes a precept and does not ask himself if it will be possible for the human being to comply with it. Rather, he accepts that it is psychologically possible for the ego of man to carry out whatever is entrusted to it, that the ego enjoys unlimited authority over its ID. Here is an error, because even in supposedly normal beings, domination over the ID cannot exceed certain limits. If the demands exceed them, a rebellion or a neurosis occurs in the individual, or he becomes unhappy. The commandment, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," is the strongest rejection of human aggressiveness and is an excellent example of the anti-psychological attitude adopted by the cultural superego. That commandment is unrealizable. Such an inflation of love cannot but undermine its value, but it will in no way succeed in remedying the evil. Culture is unconcerned about all this, limiting itself to decreeing that the more difficult it is to obey the precept, the more merit it will have to comply with. But whoever, in the current state of culture, adjusts to such a rule, will only place himself at a disadvantage in front of all those who violate it. What a powerful cultural obstacle must be aggressiveness if its rejection can make us as unhappy as its realization. The so-called natural ethics is of no use to us here, apart from the fact that it offers us the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to consider ourselves better than others. Ethics based on religion, for its part, promises us a better afterlife, but I think it will preach in the desert as long as virtue bears its fruits on this earth. I also consider it unquestionable that an objective modification of man's relations with property would be in this sense more effective than any ethical precept, but the socialists miss such just recognition, devaluing it in its realization by incurring in a new idealistic ignorance of human nature. In my opinion, the concept that the phenomena of cultural evolution can be interpreted in terms of a superego still promises to reveal new inferences. But our study comes to an end, although without avoiding one last question. If the evolution of culture has such transcendent analogies with that of the individual, and if it uses the same resources as the latter, is it not justified to diagnose that many cultures or cultural epochs, and perhaps even all of humanity, would have become neurotic under the pressure of cultural ambitions? The analytic investigation of these neuroses could well lead to therapeutic plans of great practical interest, and I would by no means dare to maintain that such an attempt to transfer psychoanalysis to the cultural community is foolish or doomed to sterility. However, one would have to proceed with great prudence, without forgetting that these are only analogies and that it is dangerous for both men and concepts if they are uprooted from the soil in which they originated and developed. Furthermore, the diagnosis of collective neuroses encounters a particular difficulty. In individual neurosis we have as the first point of reference the contrast with which the patient stands out from his environment, which we consider normal. This backdrop does not exist in a uniformly affected mass, so we should look elsewhere. As for the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what use would be the most penetrating analysis of social neuroses if no one possesses the necessary authority to impose the corresponding therapy on the masses? Despite all these difficulties, we can hope that one day someone will dare to undertake such a pathology of cultural communities. Multiple and varied reasons exclude from my purposes any attempt to value human culture. I have tried to avoid the enthusiastic prejudice according to which our culture is the most precious thing we could possess or acquire, and its path would inevitably take us to the summit of unsuspected perfection. At least I can listen without being indignant to the opinion of the critic who, taking into account the objectives pursued by cultural efforts and the resources they apply, considers it necessary to conclude that all these efforts would not be worthwhile and that the final result will only it could be an intolerable state for the individual. But it is easy for me to be impartial, since I know very little about all these things, and with certainty only one, that the estimative judgments of men are infallibly guided by the desires to achieve happiness, constituting, therefore, attempts destined to base their illusions with arguments. I would have my full understanding who tried to emphasize the forced nature of human culture, declaring, for example, that the tendency to restrict sexual life or to implant the humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection, would be an evolutionary trait that cannot be avoided or diverted, and before which it is best to submit, as if it were an inexorable law of nature. I am also familiar with the objection to this point of view. Many times, in the course of human history, tendencies considered insurmountable have been discarded and replaced by others. Thus, I lacked the necessary courage to set myself up as a prophet before my contemporaries, leaving me no choice but to expose myself to their reproaches for not being able to offer them any comfort. Well, deep down, what everyone is after is nothing else, the most frenetic revolutionaries with the same zeal as the most pious believers. In my opinion, the fate of the human species will be decided by the circumstance of whether and to what extent cultural development will manage to face the disturbances of collective life emanating from the instinct of aggression and self-destruction. In this sense, the current era perhaps deserves our particular interest. Our contemporaries have reached such an extreme in their mastery of the elemental forces that with their help it would be easy for them to exterminate each other to the last man. They know it well, and hence a good part of their present agitation, their unhappiness, and their anguish. We can only hope that the other of both celestial powers, the eternal Eros, deploys his forces to win the fight with his no less immortal adversary. But, who could predict the final outcome? End. Discomfort in Culture. Sigmund Freud.